This is it! The ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
That was the night we realized the stars had stopped ticking. No one heard a crash or saw a flash. The heavens simply forgot to move. Time, that obedient servant, knelt down and waited. I remember the stillness most clearly, the way the air thinned until every breath sounded like the turning of a page. Even insects, those sleepless scribblers of summer, silenced themselves. In the hush, I thought I could hear the arteries of the cosmos beating once, slowly, and then holding their breath with the rest of us. You, listening now, should know something. Before we drift any farther, we truly do care about you. Whoever you are, restless heart, tired mind, we love that you're here tonight. Before we begin, tell us quietly to yourself, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Good. Now grab your coffee, or maybe keep the mug only for its warmth. Let's get started. Rick was an old traveller by then, hair like half-erased chalk. He had spent most of his life running ahead of explanations, pretending discovery was the same as peace. His workshop was small, all crooked shelves and faint, light, but everything inside it hummed. Even the dust had opinions. He was bent over a rust-coloured notebook when the hum changed key. All around him clocks stalled in the same heartbeat. The second hands stood upright like tiny soldiers unsure of who to salute. Rick lifted his head, blinked. "Well," he muttered, "that's new." Outside, the moon hung motionless. Its reflection froze in puddles that had been rippling a moment before. The wind crept halfway through a sigh and decided to linger there. It was as if the universe had hit pause, not from exhaustion, but curiosity. Rick stepped to the window. Every star shone with intense patience. The firmament looked less like a field of fires and more like a ceiling of listening eyes. He felt something twist in his chest, not fear, exactly. More like recognition. He whispered, as though addressing an old friend. "I think you're waiting for me, aren't you?" No answer came, except a soft pop somewhere deep in the workshop. A jar sealed for years released its air. Inside that jar was nothing special, just a rust-coloured marble from childhood, but it rolled across the table and stopped at his hand as if volunteering for duty. When Rick picked it up, faint vibrations hummed through his fingers. For a second he could almost hear the tick of a clock within it, tiny but steady. The rest of the room remained silent. "So, you're the last one working tonight," he said, pocketing the marble. He crossed the room to the mantel, where a dozen mechanical creations were frozen mid-whir. A miniature planetarium, a brass bird that used to chirp at dawn, a pendulum clock shaped like a heart. He touched them in turn, feeling their halted energy, like touching old scars that still remember heat. He didn't panic. Rick didn't do panic. Instead, he moved carefully, as though not to disturb a sleeping animal. He poured himself tea, though the steam coiled upward too slowly, struggling through thick air. The taste was identical to memory, slightly bitter, slightly lonely. When he looked again toward the sky, he realized something subtle had shifted inside him. Normally, he would have tried to fix the phenomenon immediately, calculate its properties, identify the anomaly, restore motion. But tonight, he simply watched. The silence felt sacred. He sat on the doorstep, notebook on his knees. He began sketching what he saw. Stars like beads threaded on an invisible wire, the moon suspended on a single note. His lines drifted into spirals, then into symbols that didn't quite obey geometry. Somewhere, beyond the reach of visual spectrum, the constellations seemed to breathe. His thoughts roamed. Perhaps the universe hadn't broken. Perhaps it had grown self-aware. Maybe it had reached the end of a phrase and needed a rest. The way a musician pauses before repeating a melody an octave higher. Time could be artistry too. He remembered the first time he ever noticed time's song. As a boy, pressing his ear to a ticking clock and discovering rhythm felt like heartbeat. He'd promised himself then that he'd learn what the heartbeat meant. Decades later, he was still listening. The tea cooled. Around him, light refused to fade or brighten. The horizon stayed in a perpetual shiver of almost dawn. His reflection in the window looked both ancient and strangely hopeful, like someone expecting an answer he finally feels ready for. He opened his mouth to speak, but realized he wasn't sure to whom. "If this is the end," he said softly, "make it kind." The air responded, not with speech, but with a vibration that pulsed through his bones. On the shelves, tools trembled slightly, not from danger, but agreement. Each vibration carried fragments of tone, tiny frequencies combining into something barely audible, almost a hum. Rick frowned, leaned closer to listen. Music, the faintest suggestion of a melody woven between stillness and memory. Notes arranged not by instrument but by time's own geometry. It sounded like equations performing lullabies to themselves. He chuckled once, the sound startling in the quiet. "Of course you'd sing in math," he told the stars. "You always did love a good pattern." And then, though no physical clock resumed, a single droplet of sound echoed inside his mind. Tick. He looked down. The marble in his pocket glowed faintly, warm against his palm. The heartbeat resumed, not outside, but within. It pulsed once for every breath he took. The universe wasn't restarting, it was synchronizing with him. Rick stood, stretching old bones. The workshop groaned in sympathy. For a fleeting instant he thought he saw movement beyond the frozen trees, a figure small and bright, childlike, drifting slightly above the ground as though pulled by unseen music. The figure waved. He blinked. It was gone. Only the afterglow remained, lingering like the memory of a dream that will return later to explain itself. He smiled. "All right," he said to no one and everything. Message received. He turned off the light. Pure habit. The switch didn't change much. Then he lay back on the porch, hands folded beneath his head. Above him, thousands of unmoving stars seemed to lean closer. He spoke once more, almost whispering. "Let's see what you're waiting to show me." The stars twinkled, not movement, but consent, and somewhere in that immense, paused expanse, a new rhythm began unrolling itself, soft as rain promised, but not yet falling. Rick closed his eyes. Inside the still universe, breathing became the only form of time. Sleep settled over the world like a shawl, thin, luminous, and forgiving. Long before the pause in the heavens, there was just a boy in a cluttered room, counting heartbeats against raindrops. He didn't have the word equation yet, only the sense that certain patterns felt like lullabies. Each time, thunder rolled. Across the roof, the small vibrations on the floorboards arranged themselves into invisible lines of music, and he, tiny, serious-eyed Rick, sat cross-legged and listened as if the storm were teaching him a new language. He was an odd child, though not difficult. Teachers liked to whisper that he saw through things. Glass, rules, even disappointment. He seemed to notice the rhythm beneath them. When other children clattered blocks, he arranged them in symmetrical spirals. When the teacher wrote numbers, he hummed softly, low tones for 4s, bright ones for 7s. It drove desks to giggles and chalk to confusion. At night, his mother would peer into the darkened workshop that should have been a bedroom. "Still awake, Ricky?" she'd call, and he would answer. Almost finished listening. On his desk, empty jam jars would vibrate faintly, capturing frequencies only he seemed to hear. While the neighbors slept, the house lived through his quiet experiments. Rubber bands, stretched. Across nails, old radios disassembled for their whispers, coat hangers bent into tuning forks. The walls blinked with reflected starlight that flickered in time with his pulse. Rick believed that everything alive, or once alive, had a tempo. Even stones, if you waited long enough, arranged their atoms in the cadence of patience. He couldn't explain that to grown-ups without being laughed at, so he didn't try. Instead, he built. He built because building felt like translating what the universe was already humming. One memory outlived all the others. The night he first truly heard what numbers wanted. It had rained for days, the sky drained of color, until it resembled one of his old notebooks, grey margins, faint ruling. The power went out, plunging the house into the kind of darkness that swallows sound. And yet there it was, a tone rising softly from nowhere, or perhaps from between his own thoughts. He followed it to the half-finished contraption on his bench, a metal bowl balanced over candlelight, wires coiling up like vines. As air warmed, the bowl expanded with a ping, another wire contracted with a sigh. The two sounds overlapped and created a third, a pure harmonic note. Rick's breath hitched. It was pitch C, though he didn't know the term. He only knew he recognized it in the way one recognizes one's own name. He whispered, "Hello?" And the bowl answered with a shimmer that felt like greeting. Hours later, his mother found him asleep at the desk, cheek on his sketchbook. The candle had burned down, leaving a small crater in wax. Tiny arcs of soot drew delicate constellations onto the metal bowl. He was smiling in his sleep. She thought he looked content for once and tiptoed away. In dreams that night, the song continued, threading through lightning storms and playground laughter, forming something so consistent it nearly frightened him with its generosity. Each chord carried an emotion he would spend the rest of his life chasing, clarity without coldness. When he grew older, as equations began to populate schoolbooks, he noticed the same melodic intervals buried in them, the rise and fall of fractions, the syncopation of repeating decimals. Mathematics wasn't sterile, it was the universe whispering tempo markings. He tried to share this with classmates, but words failed. So he started drawing spirals again, lines, connecting numbers like notes on invisible staves. His first invention came from trying to show the feeling rather than describe it. Using the remains of a wind-up toy, he built a device that emitted tone whenever someone nearby felt genuine sympathy. The physics were dubious. He built it more from intuition than calculation. At first, it stayed mute except around his mother, whose worry produced the softest hum. Years later, during one of her sadder days, it sang louder, high and trembling, and both of them cried without knowing why. After that, he began to think of invention not as mastery, but as dialogue. If he could construct objects that responded to emotion, perhaps he could understand the world's hidden grammar. That gentle arrogance would become his greatest talent and his hardest loneliness. When he remembered those early attempts as an old man, he was embarrassed by their clumsiness but grateful for their sincerity. The boy hadn't wanted fame or even understanding. He'd wanted to belong to the rhythm he heard. Every coil of copper wire, every bolt and magnet was a verse in that same restless hymn. Back then, though, he could still feel wonder without fatigue. The next invention he called the empathy bell. It was nothing more than a tiny bronze disc suspended over water. When two people stood close enough to mean what they said, vibrations would quiver through the surface and make the disc ring once, softly, almost shyly. When tested among friends, it seldom made a sound. When he told the truth to himself, it sang. He kept that bell all his life, hidden among serious instruments, because deep down he knew its secret wasn't scientific at all. It simply resonated with honesty. Years passed. While classmates grew into predictable trajectories, Rick drifted sideways, between laboratories and lofts, between curiosity and isolation. He learned to hide his melodic perceptions beneath sarcasm and precision. Still, the songs persisted, underscoring each discovery with the quiet refrain of "Remember what you loved this for." One dawn, near the end of his youth, he climbed a hill carrying every small device he'd built. The air was clear enough to show the curvature of morning. One by one he placed his toys on the grass, bells, jars, a handful of resonant stones, and waited. At first, nothing. Then a breeze slipped through the valley, turning the blades of grass into tiny strings. The wind touched each instrument differently, a chime here, a pulse there, an accidental symphony rising from disarray. The sound gathered around him until he could no longer tell which tone belonged to which device or to himself. It wasn't loud, it was whole. For the first time he felt what silence could be, something built out of every note returning home. Decades later he would try, and fail, to replicate that purity with machinery. The world would call him genius. Inside he would keep chasing the simple connection the boy on the hill had found without trying. But tonight we return to that younger self. The sky above him gleamed with new constellations, ones his scientific elders had never charted. They weren't patterns of stars. They were pauses between them, empty shapes, spelling out a promise he couldn't yet read. Rick raised his head, listening. The entire horizon seemed to whisper three gentle syllables that could have been anything. Maybe his name. Maybe an unfinished theorem, maybe the soft directive of existence itself. Begin again. He smiled at the sound. Somewhere, far in the future, an older version of him would remember this exact moment when the universe first spoke in the grammar of kindness. And somewhere beyond time, that old man was, perhaps, smiling back. Morty's first remembered dream began in complete silence. No footsteps, no breeze, only the slow, uncertain weight of his own breathing. Then gravity changed its mind. At first, he thought he had tripped because the ground seemed to leave him rather than the other way around. Pebbles, bits of flour, an abandoned toy car. Everything rose alongside him as if the world had decided to exhale, and he was part of what it no longer wished to hold. He didn't panic. The motion wasn't violent. It was courteous. The grass uncurled from beneath his shoes and waved him a sleepy farewell. The air smelled of dust warming in sunlight and the barest trace of sugar. His grandmother's kitchen, maybe, though he couldn't be sure. The dream carried him upward very slowly, the way bubbles find their way through honey. Beneath him, the neighborhood spread like a patient map. Roofs resembled pages of a closed book. Streets glimmered with tiny reflections of people who hadn't yet realized they were reflections. He laughed once, out of surprise, and that sound made him rise faster. The laugh was lighter than he'd expected. Maybe weight was linked not to mass, but to worry, and tonight he had left most of his worries in bed. Higher still, and a thought came. It didn't feel like his own. Falling upward isn't escape. It's returning to the place that remembers love without disappointment. He tried to answer, but his voice blended with the wind. It no longer mattered. The message had been accepted. Clouds gathered like slow-moving whales. One rolled over to show an eye as blue as disbelief. "Rick?" Morty asked half-jokingly. Of course, the cloud didn't reply in words, but the air shifted, forming ripples that almost resembled laughter. Then thunder spoke in bass tones that sounded strangely mathematical, notes repeated rising in perfect ratios. Morty was too sleepy to analyze. Still, a name surfaced, and the one his grandfather always muttered when excited. Phi, the golden ratio, the music of balance, he realized distantly. He was inside someone else's equation. The sky thinned into translucent ivory. Stars lay just beyond, swirling and patient, but unlike the ones in the real world, these moved knowingly. One leaned forward, as if watching him approach. "You again?" it said without sound. "You always forget the fun parts." Morty stretched out a hand. His fingers passed through radiance and came back tingling. The star's glow lingered on his skin like affectionate static. He asked, "Is this outer space?" The star pulsed once, a no, or maybe a smile, and softened itself until he could see shapes inside it. Two figures bent over a cluttered table, one tall, one small. They were laughing the kind of laugh that bruises the ribs slightly because it feels like belonging. The taller one said, "Careful with that, it reacts to happiness." Morty didn't know these people, and yet he felt the echo of that laughter vibrating in his own chest. The vision faded as new clouds rolled between them, but warmth stayed, pulsing faintly under his sternum. He continued to ascend, or perhaps descend. Direction had lost meaning. Time itself seemed to swim. He remembered a story his mother once told him about rivers that forgot which way was downstream, folding back to hug their source. Maybe dreams were made of that kind of river. As he drifted, he noticed faint objects accompanying him. A marble, a tiny bronze bell, and a shard of mirror. They rotated lazily around him like loyal moons. Each vibrated to a different tempo, and together they formed something that could almost be called a chord. The bell's ring was low and compassionate. The marble ticked in perfect rhythm. The mirror reflected light as intermittent harmonics. Morty listened. Somehow the three sounds together told a sentence. "You will meet the one who made us. He's waiting where numbers breathe." He opened his mouth to answer, but all that emerged was breath. Warm, full of glimmers. His words became fireflies and disappeared among stars. Understanding didn't need vocabulary. Far below, the earth looked softer now. No harsh lines, just a gentle blur, like watercolor after rain. Street lights curved into constellations of their own. People slept, perhaps dreaming of him the way he dreamed of them. He wondered if everyone occasionally fell upward in their sleep and simply didn't remember upon waking. The wind changed again. It tightened its spiral, and Morty realized he was being guided. Not away, not home, but toward when. That was the only description that made sense. He was about to arrive in a moment yet to happen. The clouds parted as though answering an invitation. There, suspended in endless blue, hung a workshop unlike any building he'd ever imagined. Tools floated mid-air, notes of music quivered between them. A man with grey hair sat inside, sketching circles that overlapped like family trees. The boy's drifting slowed. He hovered at the open window. For an instant the man raised his head, eyes narrowing, half convinced he'd heard a whisper. Their gazes met through glass. Neither flinched. Across that thin divide future bent toward past. Rick, the older traveller, saw not an apparition, but the memory of every innocence he'd once misplaced. The boy drifting above him saw curiosity itself, weary yet luminous. Neither spoke. The silence was more fluent than language. A current of air passed between them, and with it a tune, the same delicate sequence Rick had heard from his marble the night the universe paused. Only here, in this dream sky, the rhythm found its echo. It was the same song played both forward and backward. Rick's lips moved. Morty's breath matched his. The chord resolved neatly, like an equation satisfied. Then gravity made its quiet decision again. This time, Morty felt himself drifting downward, not falling, not pulled, exactly invited. The clouds murmured encouragement. The star he'd touched earlier whispered goodbye, but in tones suggesting until next lesson. The marble, the bell, the mirror, each dimmed and followed him like fireflies guiding descent. He landed softly, feet kissing earth as the first real light of morning found its way across his face. The hum of refrigerators, barking dogs, distant engines all returned in a slow swell of normality. He opened his eyes, ceiling fan turning, alarm clock blinking, bedroom. Yet on his fingertips, faint sparks still lingered, pulsing to the same rhythm as his heart. He couldn't tell whether he'd brought the music back or whether it had been waiting here all along. In the distance, a thunderhead rolled, a polite reminder that day had begun. Morty sat up, hair a wild static crown, and laughed without knowing why. The sound made the air shimmer for a second. Somewhere across the neighborhood, in a tiny workshop that surely didn't exist yet in this version of time, Rick paused mid-note, frowning. He felt a lightness behind his ribs, a faint tug, as if a new melody were introducing itself. "Well," he said to the room, "hello there, whoever you are." Had either tried to explain what had just connected them, language would have collapsed under its own astonishment. But explanation wasn't the goal. Dreams, after all, are letters addressed to a future self, and this one had just been delivered. Morning light spilled through the high window of Rick's workshop, softened by weeks of dust on the pane. It came in slow, golden waves that pooled around scattered papers and unfinished devices. The clocks, which had obediently resumed since that strange night when time itself paused, now ticked cautiously, as if aware they were being watched. Rick sat at his bench, the marble from that night between his fingers. When he rolled it across the table, it hummed faintly. The hum was comfort and question all at once. "I hear you," he murmured. "But what exactly are you asking for?" Blueprints surrounded him, equations written in musical staves, designs for machines that measured intangible things, affection in voltage, truth in lumens. He smiled at the impracticality of it all. Then his eyes landed on a sketch he didn't remember drawing. Inked in silver pencil was a rectangle, labeled pain for seeing feelings. He traced the outline. The memory of his dream, of that floating boy, that curious echo of himself, tugged gently at his thoughts. Without deciding, he began to build. He collected fragments of tempered glass, rinsed them in rainwater that still smelled faintly of starlight. He ground fine powders, quartz, ash, a drop of something distilled from memory itself, and melted them together in the heart of a handmade furnace. The mixture glowed, neither solid nor liquid, and within it shone faint colors that seemed to respond to the rhythm of his breathing. As the glass cooled, a sound emerged, not sharp, but tender, like a sigh discovering voice. Rick laughed softly. "You're alive then. Wonderful. Let's see what you want to show." He framed the cooling pane in brass and held it to the window. Outside, the horizon trembled. For a heartbeat, he thought the world itself might ripple apart again, but it was only the pane adjusting, tuning itself to reality. Within seconds, surfaces of ordinary things began to shift. The trees became translucent, revealing currents of warm light traveling through their trunks. The air hummed in visible patterns, a lattice of compassion and unfinished thoughts. Then Rick caught his own reflection. It was him, of course, older, greyer, but the glass rearranged what it saw, equations drifting behind his eyes, regret perched patiently on his shoulder, pride folded neat and small in the pocket of his coat. His mouth curved upwards, but inside the reflection, that smile faltered. The eyes in the image whispered, "You have been clever when you could have been kind." He dropped the pane to his side, startled by the intimacy of it, nearly charmed by how precisely it understood him. "Well," he said aloud to the quiet room, "nothing like being reprimanded by one's own invention." He wasn't angry. Relief, perhaps, that the glass was honest. He set it upright again, this time turning it toward the empty doorway. Light flickered once, and a figure appeared faintly within the pane. A boy, hair tousled, staring back with the dazed wonder of someone mid-dream. Morty. The image pulsed like a heartbeat captured between worlds. Rick froze. Every hair on his arms stood up. The boy's lips moved. He seemed to be saying something, but no sound crossed. The pane itself trembled as if torn between reflection and revelation. Rick touched its surface. It was warm, almost like skin. The boy tilted his head, mirroring Rick exactly. They both spoke at once. "Who are you?" The words echoed not by ear, but by feeling. In that moment, the glass shone brighter, as though translating comprehension into light. Through it, Rick saw fragments of another place. Pastel walls, scattered notebooks, sunlight he didn't recognize. The boy blinked up at him with awe, though Rick sensed beneath it fear. The deep, trembling fear of discovering that your dreams are watching back. "I'm not—" "I don't bite," Rick said, trying to sound reassuring. The memory of gentleness was rusty but serviceable. The boy's mouth quirked, not smiling, not frowning either. He mouthed something impossible to decipher. Then from the air on Rick's side, a faint tone emanated, identical to the one that had haunted the paused universe. The glass became a speaker for that music, vibrating with the same sequence his marble adored. Each pulse corresponded perfectly to the boy's heartbeat on the other side. Rick's scientific mind sparked with fascination, his human heart softened with recognition. This wasn't experiment, it was reunion across untranslatable math. He whispered to the vibrating window, "So you're the one the marble's been waiting for?" The boy raised his hand. Rick mirrored him. Their palms met against the transparent divide, separated by only the thickness of wonder. The pain warmed under their touch until both could see, not faces anymore, but emotions, flashes of curiosity, loneliness, shy courage, and, most dazzling of all, trust. Rick blinked back a haze of tears he refused to name. "Same pattern," he whispered. "Same song." Sudden brightness filled the workshop. The glass blazed white, erasing contours. For a heartbeat he saw everything. Countless other versions. Of himself and the boy, in timelines folding like pages, all touching the same luminous thread between them. Then the brilliance collapsed gently, like a breath settling. The glass turned opaque, only reflecting again. The link was gone, for now. Rick leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the cool surface. It showed only him, older, uncertain, but not alone anymore. "Well," he said to his reflection, "seems we just met." He carried the pane outside and planted it upright in the soil, where sunrise could reach it directly. The new day broke over it, scattering small prisms onto the grass. When breeze passed through, light danced across the yard, tiny bursts of color that flickered in rhythm, as if the glass remembered the heartbeat of the boy's world. For the rest of the morning, Rick sat beside it, sketching notes and symbols, pretending to analyze what he had seen. Inside, however, something gentler was unfolding. Gratitude for proof that connection wasn't confined to logic. Somewhere, beyond probability, someone had seen him back. As hours slipped toward afternoon, the shadows lengthened. He touched the brass frame one more time, whispering, "Stay honest." The glass replied with a faint shimmer that felt like promise. Behind him, the workshop resumed its modest symphony of ticking mechanisms and soft clanks. Inside his pocket, the marble pulsed twice, forming a tiny rhythm. Rick smiled to himself, not realizing he was humming in tune. Above the house, sunlight fractured itself into 1,000 shades. They moved lazily through the air, slow and deliberate, like thoughts choosing which memories to illuminate next. What Rick didn't notice was that, miles away, a boy named Morty awoke from an afternoon nap, heart pounding to a rhythm he didn't know, whispering the same melodies under his breath. He reached toward sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and thought, "The glass looks alive today." Two worlds, humming in different keys, had just agreed to keep listening. The road out of the valley curved like a dream half remembered. Rick followed it before dawn, his coat pockets clinking with tiny devices that still hadn't decided whether they were inventions or companions. He hadn't planned the trip. The glass pane in his yard had shimmered all night with a subtle pulse that pointed east, a soft insistence that beyond the hills something waited to be understood. By mid-morning, the landscape changed. Grass turned silver in the sunlight, and the wind hummed low notes through hollow reeds that grew along the roadside. At the crest of a hill he saw it, a small town folded neatly into a bowl of fog. Chimneys crooked like pencils, rooftops quiet as held breath. No smoke, no motion. It looked abandoned, yet strangely intact, as if everyone had gone to lunch at the same time and simply forgotten to return. He reached the first house, knocked, and waited. The door gave way with a slow creak. Inside, a woman froze halfway through the act of pouring tea. The liquid had stiffened mid-arc, a golden ribbon suspended between pot and cup, gleaming in unmoving sunlight that didn't bother to shift across the table. Despite the stillness, the air was warm, even welcoming. Rick stepped closer, studying the impossible physics. Molecules should have fallen. Time should have dragged them downward. Instead, they hung there, content. He whispered, "Temporal suspension through collective dreaming, or just mercy in disguise." A soft shuffle behind him answered, "Morty," or rather the presence of Morty, his echo through dream, traveling on the same wavelength the pane had opened. Rick felt him rather than saw him, an invisible companion leaning curiously over his shoulder. "What is this place?" the boy's voice asked, from somewhere inside his head. Rick smiled faintly. Maybe a town that grew tired of alarms. He walked the narrow streets, boots crunching on gravel that barely acknowledged gravity. Every window framed a similar scene. Families asleep but upright. Candles frozen mid-burn, their flames solid as amber drops. The absence of suffering struck him first. No fear in the faces, no frozen gasps. Just deep rest. It was unsettling and tender at the same time. A signpost at the square read, "Welcome to Stillford, the town that never rushes." The last word was half-painted. Brush left curved in air, bristles unchanged by years. He set up his recorder, one of those small brass cylinders that translated silence into data, and let it spin. The needle trembled lightly, registering faint vibrations. Not zero. The town wasn't dead. It was singing in a frequency folded beneath the range of ears. He amplified it until the murmur reached audibility. A slow, even rhythm, 12 breaths per minute, the perfect cadence of sleep, Morty's voice whispered with awe. They're dreaming together. Rick sat on the fountain's edge, elbows on knees. Water inside the fountain stood sculpted mid-splash. Light refracted through droplets into tiny rainbows that refused to slide away. He noticed something etched on the stone rim, a phrase weathered almost smooth. When noise forgets itself, music remembers you. How long had they been like this? Weeks? Centuries? He considered waking one resident to find out, but the idea felt rude. The last time he forced the universe awake, it had lost half its color for a year. Instead, he listened. Beneath the town's breathing lay fragments of narrative, dreams whispering freely, unconcerned about logic. A baker shaping clouds into loaves, children chasing their shadows through underwater fields, an old postman finally delivering the letter he'd been writing since birth. Each fantasy drifted toward peace. None spiraled into nightmare. It's working, Morty said softly. They found a way to rest. Maybe, Rick answered, eyes distant. Or maybe the world gave them this because they asked gently enough. He felt emotion rising, not envy exactly, but longing, the academic's exhaustion after centuries of explanation. He touched the fountain. Its minerals softly vibrated against his fingerprint, like a pulse at rest. Compassion, the stone-possessed compassion. A low bell rang somewhere deeper in town, slow and forgiving. The sound unfroze a single feather mid-air. It drifted down onto Rick's sleeve, proof of small movement permitted under strict conditions. He realized then that the stasis wasn't perfect. It allowed room for softness, for reconsideration. The laws of physics here believed in nap breaks, Rick whispered, half to Morty, half to the town. I spent centuries teaching reality to behave. Maybe reality just wanted a nap and couldn't tell me. He imagined the maintenance of such serenity, a collective decision made during simultaneous dreams, every inhabitant reaching silent agreement. Let's pause everything until we feel whole again. He smiled at the thought. Progress through tenderness. By midday, the sun refused to climb any higher. Birds hung mid-glide in the clear air. Their tiny hearts beat audibly, but without hurry. Rick unpacked a sandwich from his coat pocket, an old habit from busier worlds, and ate half, leaving the rest beside the sleeping baker's doorstep. His small, unnecessary offering. Then he spoke quietly to the unseen boy presence. You hear that rhythm, Morty? Slow inhale, slow exhale. Keep it with you. It's the tempo of peace. If the universe ever trembles again, play this back. Morty's laughter traveled through his thoughts like wind chimes. I'll try, but you know me. Patience isn't my strong suit. Then borrow theirs, Rick answered. He spent the afternoon scribbling notes. Not measurements this time, but impressions. Silence chooses kindness. Stillness does not mean stopped. The recorder filled with the town's heartbeat. A small part of him dreaded ever playing it at full volume, afraid it might put the rest of reality to sleep out of sympathy. Eventually he rose. The roads leading out were still, though somewhere beyond the hills, clouds were gathering like curtains, preparing for night. He looked back once. The frozen tea, the quiet laughter beneath dreams, the golden air, everything exactly as he'd found it. And yet, he had the strange conviction that when morning truly came, whether tomorrow or 1,000 years hence, the town would awaken naturally, stretch, yawn, and ask if he'd slept well too. He touched his notebook to his forehead in salute. Sleep tight, Stilford, he said. You've done enough thinking for all of us. As he turned away, the recorder in his pocket gave a timid chirp, a single tone shaped like gratitude. He chose not to analyze it. For once, unmeasured data felt beautiful. By nightfall, he had climbed out of the fog basin. The first stars were beginning to blink, tentative after their long previous pause. Above, each seemed to pulse to the same calm beat he carried from the valley. Inhale, exhale, hush. Rick smiled into the dark. He didn't need to fix Stilford. The experiment's success was humility itself, proof that certain networks of hearts could keep entire towns breathing kindly. He filled his lungs with the cool air and whispered to the sky, "Rest is a form of progress too." The stars shimmered in quiet agreement, and somewhere behind him, in that little town that refused urgency, 1,000-strong sigh of contentment rolled through every dreamer, a wave of peace that stretched past the hills. Rick felt it reach him, a promise upholstering the edges of the night. "When you're ready, old man, sleep can be an answer," he laughed softly, pulled his coat tighter, and continued down the road toward whatever dawn the universe would allow next. Fog followed Rick out of Stilford like an old friend too shy to say goodbye. It coiled around his boots as he walked, thick enough to erase everything except the sound of his breathing. Somewhere inside its cotton hush, he could still feel the rhythm of the sleeping town, the steady, slow inhale that had lulled even his instruments into quiet. The symmetry of it stayed in him for miles, a peace so absolute it almost felt like guidance. Then the fog began to vibrate. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, but the sensation deepened, a pulse running beneath the soil. The vibration wasn't random. It repeated in clean, deliberate intervals, the pattern of a clock beating backward. His marble answered in kind, glowing through the fabric of his pocket, tapping out the same reversed rhythm like a friendly heart, having second thoughts. "Ah," he muttered, smiling despite the chill. "The universe is tuning up again." The world narrowed to that sound. It wasn't merely echoing through air. It spoke, the intervals bending inward, forming fragments of syllables that uncurled in unfamiliar order. The mist translated its own voice in slow, backward cadence, too patient for panic, too strange for comfort. Rick followed the pulse down a ridge until the ground beneath him hardened into polished stone. Steps appeared, carved into the hillside, each engraved with mathematical symbols that seemed to breathe when he looked away from them. At the bottom, a gate waited, not designed exactly, but grown from interlocking gears of brass, silver, glass, and something darker than metal. None moved, all shivered with the hint of withheld motion. He pressed a palm against the gate. To his surprise, it yielded, hinges sighing open like an organism relieved to stretch. Light filtered through, not warm sunlight, but a mechanical glow thin as mercury poured through latticework. A hall spread before him, vast and circular, every surface decorated with clock faces, pendulums, hourglasses. Some ticked, others seemed asleep. All shared one heartbeat, and at the centre, suspended without string or magnet, hovered the largest pendulum he'd ever seen, a column of pure light, swinging lazily backward. "Beautiful," he whispered. Terrible sense of direction, but beautiful. As if in answer, the air changed. A murmur rose, equal parts electricity and breath. Then a shimmer condensed at the far end of the hall, a figure forming out of refracted time itself. Its body was gears under glass, its eyes a pair of endlessly rotating clock hands. When it spoke, sentences leaked out in wrong order, beginning with their verbs and finding subjects only at the end. Rick had to tilt his head and let comprehension arrive one beat late. "You again late are," it said, then corrected itself with a gentler sigh. "Sorry, you were late again," Rick chuckled. "And you're early?" "Always," said the figure. "I am the one who keeps the pauses." "The clockmaker, then?" The figure bowed slightly. You remembered before remembering. Efficient. Rick stuffed his hands in his pockets, studying the enormous pendulum. Each backward swing birthed a gust of cool air, smelling faintly of rain that hadn't yet fallen. What is this place? A confession booth for time travelers? A maintenance shop, said the clockmaker softly. Clocks break. Moments slip. I restore equilibrium. Though lately, it added, voice turning inward, equilibrium prefers a nap. That tends to happen, Rick said dryly. Entropy has no work ethic. The mechanical face rippled towards something like amusement. You used to enjoy jokes. You've misplaced joy 6 iterations ago. Can't imagine where I left it, Rick muttered. Lost and found? Buried under accomplishment, said the clockmaker. You measure progress the way others measure snowfall, forgetting that sometimes the storm is rest. They stood in silence, surrounded by the soft grinding of sleeping mechanisms. Rick felt no fear, only a creeping awareness, a déjà vu that hurt behind his ribs. The shorter ticks around them calibrated themselves to his pulse. For a sickening moment he thought they might stop entirely if he did. Did you? He asked finally. Pause the stars? Not pause, said the clockmaker. Let them listen. They asked for quiet, and quiet was given. And Stilford? The town that forgot to wake? The figure's glass chest flickered with reflected constellations. Their dream reached me first. I lent them continuity. You noticed? I did. Good, said the clockmaker. Observation is love's most underrated sibling. Rick tried not to smile. Philosophical for an appliance. Sympathy is built into the springs, the being replied, unoffended. Its gears slowed until each tick came as a soft moccasin step on moss. The universe requires maintenance through tenderness. Violence only resets. Gentleness repairs. The words scraped something hidden inside him. You think I'm violent? I think you're fast, it said kindly. And speed is the most sophisticated form of avoidance. The charge landed with surgical precision. He had no counter-argument. He turned away, busying himself examining a row of wall clocks frozen at different hours, all 3:10, all reversed. In each glass cover, he caught a reflection of himself at different ages: child, skeptic, traveller, survivor. Each blinked independently, some smiling, others weary. You are composed of moments still waiting to meet each other, murmured the clockmaker. That meeting will be your finale. Rick swallowed a retort that contained equal parts awe and sarcasm. And I'm guessing you'll be there with confetti. No confetti, said the clockmaker. Only release. The pendulum brightened mid-conversation, shedding sparks that rose instead of fell. With every reverse swing, the air around them thickened with harmonic sound, a chord that refused resolution. Time itself seemed to inhale. I should probably go before you start charging rent, Rick said, glancing nervously as the light grew stronger. The figure tilted its head. You will. But remember our bargain. What bargain? The one you will soon offer, it said patiently. Listen to the boy. He hums the cure you've forgotten to need. This time, fear did flicker through him, a gentle, disarming fear that felt like intimacy rather than threat. You've met him? I will. The clockmaker raised its hands, palms outward. Every gear in the hall rotated once, then froze. The backward pendulum halted mid-arc and hung there, gleaming like a dying thought suspended for review. Silence bloomed sharp as dawn. Find your rest, Rick, the clockmaker whispered. Before it finds you out of habit, then light cracked. The figure unraveled into dust made of commas, tiny curling fragments of unfinished sentences drifting apart in the air. All at once, time started again, forward. The marble in Rick's coat pulsed one last steady beat, synced to his own heart, then cooled to gentle stillness. He exhaled, dizzy, but calmer than he'd been in decades. He walked back up the stone steps into daylight that seemed softer, rephased. No fog this time, only clear sky turning the color of forgiveness. The rhythm he'd heard underground lingered faintly in his chest, not as reprimand but melody. Well, he said to the empty hills, lesson received, if not necessarily learned. A breeze carried back a barely audible chuckle, the residue of gears parting. You always learn eventually, it seemed to say. Though maybe that was just imagination holding his hand. Rick adjusted his coat, set one deliberate foot in front of the other, and began traveling again, not away from the silence, but with it, like a tune playing quietly in his pocket. His pace, for once, matched the patience of the world around him. And somewhere far behind, beneath the sleeping machinery, an unseen pendulum completed the swing. It had begun 1,000 years ago, forward, through light into tomorrow. Rick arrived back on the main road at dusk, carrying less exhaustion than he expected and more silence than the world knew what to do with. Wind brushed the grass to one side, then to the other, as though begging him to pick a direction. He ignored the gesture, sitting down instead. The old hymn would have called that laziness. Tonight, it felt like strategy. He took inventory of the pocketed relics from his recent wandering. The marble that now glowed faintly like an obedient star, the recorder still filled with Stilford's collective hush, and a small gear he'd touched as he left the clockmaker's hall. The gear ticked occasionally inside its glass vial, a soft heartbeat reminding him he wasn't finished learning. Twilight stretched into indigo. The first evening, insects broke the sound barrier of silence with cautious chirps. Rick smiled at that. Life, it seemed, had made peace with its own background noise. He rummaged through his bag for tools and wire, though he wasn't sure yet what he was building. Maybe only proof that curiosity could coexist with calm. Somewhere ahead lay a cluster of houses, faint lanterns winking through trees. A small town again, but not asleep this time. Smoke rose from a single chimney. As he approached, voices drifted toward him. Two, then several more, gathered around something central. He stepped into a clearing and saw them, villagers surrounding an enormous mechanical sculpture half toppled in their square. It looked like a wind chime the size of a whale skeleton, all delicate rods and suspended spheres. At its base were bits of fabric tangled around wires, apparently ripped free by a storm. No one moved to repair it. They only watched, whispering as if afraid to breathe too loudly near machinery older than themselves. Rick's instincts twitched awake. He approached, gloves snapping into place out of long habit. "May I?" A grey-haired woman turned, clearly startled but too polite to interfere. "Be careful," she warned. "Every time we hammer a piece back, it falls apart again." "That's because you're fighting the music," he said. "Anything built to sing resents force." They blinked at him. He grinned, because confusion was often the first step to understanding. He untangled a length of fabric, laid the wires gently over his knee, listened to their faint vibration, and there, underneath human fear, the broken sculpture hummed like a wounded animal wanting kindness more than repair. He spoke to it the way one speaks to frightened dogs, low, steady, respectful. "I get it," he murmured. "You tried too hard to sound perfect." Then slowly he began fitting parts together with fingertips instead of wrenches. Each touch found the right tension by tone rather than measurement. A missing peg was replaced with a twig, a torn string with a thread from his own coat lining. Villagers watched in silence, mystified not by skill but by gentleness. When he finished, he backed away without testing it. "Wind will know the truth sooner than we will," he said. For a long exhale, nothing happened. Then a breeze arrived, tentative as apology. The sculpture began to move, not precisely as designed, but beautifully. Short, low notes mingled with distant high tones until a slow chord filled the square like morning filtered through honey. Children gasped. Dogs, long subdued, lifted their heads. Rick nodded. There you go. Singing's just breathing with ambition, the oldest villager frowned thoughtfully. Who are you? He shrugged. Someone who's finally learning tempo. The remark drew mild laughter. People began unclenching. A child near the front stepped forward, offering him a small, broken toy, a tin bird missing its wings. Can you fix this too? Rick felt the world tilt within that tiny request. Once he might have brushed it aside. Now he accepted, palms open. Do you mind if it flies differently when I'm done? The child shook their head. He bent, reattached the wings with wire from the sculpture's surplus, and added one feather from his own hair tie, a relic from long nights among equations. He wound its key. To everyone's astonishment, the bird didn't flap upward but hovered sideways, circling the crowd at eye level like a lazy idea refusing conclusion. The children giggled until even the adults smiled through their reservations. When the laughter settled, Rick noticed how the air felt, a collective exhale of community. He realized the clockmaker had been right. Defiance didn't always roar. Sometimes it was a whisper that refused despair. He remained among them through supper, sharing bread, and listening rather than teaching. The villagers told tales of drought survived through patience, of music that healed crops, of the day a clock fell from the tower but kept ticking anyway. Each story glowed softly with improbable truth. Under the calm chatter, Rick's mind replayed the pendulum's warning. Use what the boy teaches you, not what you teach him. He wondered what Morty would think of this town, probably declare it weird, but honest. That thought made him grin mid-bite. As night deepened, lanterns replaced curiosity with comfort. Before sleep, he walked back to the now singing sculpture. He tied his recorder beneath its lowest rod and let it capture the night breeze weaving through metallic voices. The melody wasn't grand. It was downright humble, built of pauses and resumed phrases, the same rhythm that had carried Stilford's dreams. He whispered, a quiet benediction, for the universe, when it forgets why it started. The next morning came stitched with the soft light of satisfaction. The villagers were busy again, energy restored. The boy with the tin bird presented it proudly, still spinning sideways, still defying logic. It flies wrong, he said, beaming. That's the best kind, Rick replied. Most straight lines end up missing the view. As he packed his tools, someone pressed a loaf of bread into his hands. Another offered him thread dyed in shades of dawn. He declined most gifts, but accepted a small bell they insisted he take, said to ring only for kindness. Its tone was clear, almost identical to the note produced by the marble when it was happy. He tucked it beside the marble and felt their melodies align inside his coat, like two friends exchanging stories. On the edge of town, he turned back one last time. The mechanical sculpture glimmered, catching in its metallic ribs the rising sun. Each gust of wind coaxed from it a single low tone that lingered in the air long after sound should have faded. That echo followed him up the road for miles. He walked until afternoon haze blurred distance into warmth. With every footstep, he noticed small repairs the world performed on itself, leaves adjusting angle toward generosity of light, ants clearing grains from path of rain, stones remaining steadfast simply because someone must. He whispered to the horizon, half prayer, half theorem. Kindness is gravity's secret twin. Far above, clouds rearranged themselves into slow applause. Rick would have denied seeing it, but somewhere deep inside the boy he once was clapped back, and the music of defiance, a sound built, not from rebellion but care, played softly beneath his ribs as he resumed his quiet pilgrimage toward whatever lesson waited. Beyond the next hill, the weather turned strange before dawn. Clouds gathered without sky for them to stand on, folding over one another like blankets being politely adjusted by invisible hands. Rick woke to the mild panic of silence that comes before a storm, trying to remember how thunder worked. He was camped beneath an abandoned rail trestle, his hat tilted over his face, the marble and the little kindness bell resting beside him like tiny planets orbiting the gravity of morning. He sat up, stretched, listened. No birds, no wind, only a faint vibration. Then, without ceremony, the rain began. It didn't fall downward. It simply was. Droplets appeared mid-air, as though the sky had finally admitted its jealousy of land and come to visit. Rick held out a hand. The water passed through his fingers, through the ground beneath him, through everything solid. It left no wetness, only a cool sensation, like remembrance sliding through the cracks of the present. For a moment, the entire valley shimmered like glass being breathed upon. Every color became translucent, painted in patience. He whispered, mostly to reassure his mind, phase shift precipitation. Reality's favorite bath. The marble in his pocket vibrated once, a small affirmative heartbeat. Rick chuckled. You'd think after all these years I'd stop being surprised. He stood, shaking off dust that wasn't wet, and began walking toward a nearby village that hadn't existed yesterday. The roofs there were thin sheets of slate. Smoke rose cleanly from square chimneys, yet evaporated halfway up. As he approached, the sight both amazed and unsettled him. People moved about perfectly unharmed, the curious rain passing straight through their umbrellas, their clothes, their laughter. A shopkeeper waved as Rick entered the lane. "Good morning, traveller," the man said cheerfully, voice echoing slightly as if spoken in a cathedral. "Fine weather for cleaning, if one happens to need cleansing," Rick grinned. "Physically or otherwise?" The shopkeeper winked. "Whichever you've avoided longest." He continued down the street. Every passerby seemed touched by quiet delight. They carried on conversations as though surrounded by invisible music. He caught fragments. "It remembered my name this time. My walls feel lighter. Mother's letters smell like rain again." The scientist in him took furious notes even while the human part of him simply looked upward in awe. Droplets made no splash nor sound, yet he could feel within each a whisper, a microscopic echo not of cloud or ocean, but of memory. The rain fell through matter, collecting what people forgot they needed to release. He wondered if it would find anything worth taking from him. It did. Without notice, warmth slid through the top of his hat and into hair he'd neglected for centuries of impatience. Light tingled under his skin as though softly reminding each cell of its origin. Suddenly, he was seeing past his own thoughts. Childhood rooms, perfumed with metal and tea. His mother standing at a cracked window, humming to keep time moving. He saw the experiments that had failed kindly and those that had succeeded cruelly. He saw the faces of countless Mortys, each eager and frightened in slightly different shades. The rain fell through those memories as calmly as it had through ceilings. It left them intact but rinsed of weight. Even regrets shone under the wash, translucent instead of opaque. Rick found himself laughing, a short, disbelieving sound that made nearby children turn and stare, then laugh with him, though they didn't know why. Laughter, too, became a shared particle. He leaned against an unbothered lamppost and whispered to the downpour, "You're doing good work up there, or down here, or wherever you've decided to operate." The rain answered in movement, droplets aligning briefly into spirals above his head, forming what looked suspiciously like an equation made of light. Not numbers, feelings transcribed into rhythm. When he blinked, it was gone, replaced with more gentle translucence. He took shelter in the nearest cafe, even though shelter served no purpose. The interior glowed with evenly distributed mist. Tables, patrons, and cups all partly see-through, their edges dreaming themselves halfway elsewhere. He ordered nothing, because appetite feels redundant inside wonder. Across the room, a young couple sat beneath the most persistent leak in existence. The man's hand passed through the unending cascade to rest on his partner's cheek, water sliding straight through both without interrupting affection. Rick smiled. Somewhere inside his chest, the marble heated, almost molten now, resonating with the same tenderness. When he stepped back outside, the rain had begun to sing. Or perhaps humans were now quiet enough to hear it. Thousands of invisible threads hummed through the air, in unison, each drop a note within a symphony of forgiveness. It wasn't melodic. It was structural, the kind of sound you could lean against. He thought of the clockmaker's hall, of gears moving backward, of lessons about slowing down. Maybe this was the sequel, matter itself learning humility. He turned his face toward the sky and let everything corporeal pass through him. Worry, guilt, the itch for explanation. He felt light enough to float and heavy enough to matter. When the rain finally ceased, it did so mid-fall. One moment droplets, the next moment clarity, as though someone had rewritten the level of reality's transparency and forgotten to justify it. Surfaces sparkled without moisture. Air smelled faintly of metal and absence. People resumed walking, waving goodbye to cleansed ghosts the way commuters wave to departing trains. Rick wandered to the edge of town, where the ground sloped toward a pond. The water's surface reflected nothing at all, forcing him to see the true sky above, bright, tired, honest. He crouched, touched the pond, despite the warning of silence, and found that even it allowed his fingertips passage. Still, ripples appeared, not outward, but inward, spiraling deep into the unseen. He let the bell from the kindness town dangle over the water. It chimed once, perfectly clear, then echoed back inverted, a high tone answered by low murmur, balance acknowledging itself. Morty's voice, faint but distinct, drifted through recollection or telepathy. It was hard to tell which. "Hey, Grandpa, feels nice, doesn't it?" "It does," Rick answered aloud, even for an old cynic. The memory rain had achieved what years of clarity could not, peace that required explanation from no one. He lingered until the ground dried invisibly beneath him, only then realizing the soles of his boots were spotless. All dust had passed through, taking boredom with it. As dusk approached, villagers lit lanterns. Light from them reached into the air and refused to stop, threads of gold hanging upright as souvenirs from the reversed shower. Rick walked through the glittering lanes, thinking of Stilford, of gears, of the boy in the glass who kept appearing at edges of understanding. All of it was beginning to feel connected by this new element called gentleness, the physics of care. He left the town quietly, as was his habit. At the crest of the hill he looked back. Roofs shone faintly translucent. He could almost see the lives moving warmly beneath. The village bells rang, releasing one drop more into the cool night. That drop floated upward, perhaps falling home. Rick wiped his glasses, though they needed no cleaning. "If this keeps up," he muttered, "I might accidentally evolve." The universe, somewhere above, chuckled in pure water. For once, he didn't correct it. He walked on under a sky, free of rain but full of possibility, each step echoing with the soft tempo of release. By the time Rick reached the next ridge, evening had dissolved into that indecisive hour between blue and grey. Clouds lingered like tired thoughts, but the new calm that followed the strange rain made the world shimmer with residual warmth. He could smell damp stone, pine resin, and a sweetness he couldn't name, something like nostalgia slowly toasting itself over invisible fire. He found rest in an inn too small to advertise its own existence. The sign above the door read only, "Stop a while." Inside, everything hummed quietly. The kettle, the floorboards, even light itself. There were no clocks. The innkeeper explained with a knowing smile. Our guests sleep better when the hours forget their counting. Rick, amused, hung his coat on a hook that swayed as though greeting him. Then I'll try forgetting too, he said, and took a seat beside the hearth. The interior seemed expectant, a single empty table laid with 2 cups, steam rising from just one. The other cup waited silently in front of him, warmth travelling through the porcelain like a heartbeat. He didn't question that someone or something had anticipated him. Travel had made him accustomed to hospitality from the universe itself. He poured tea that wasn't his and found it perfectly steeped. Its surface reflected a perfect circle of lamplight, a small sun inside a cup. When he exhaled, ripples disturbed the reflection and distorted the light, turning it into a galaxy momentarily stirred by breath. He watched until the pattern steadied, returning to tranquility. Everything eventually found equilibrium if you left it alone long enough. He was thinking about this when the bell over the door chimed. Morty stepped in, or rather, one version of Morty, weary but bright-eyed, wearing the expression of someone who'd travelled too far inside a dream and only half returned. Rick felt surprise rise, then dissolve into gentle recognition. They didn't speak at first. Time slowed enough for the unspoken you again to settle comfortably between them. Morty sat opposite him. For a long moment they simply listened to the faint crackle of fire. Then the boy blinked awkwardly. So, do we talk about the weird sky stuff or just drink tea and pretend? Rick smiled into his cup. Pretend first, analyze later. Always hydrate before existentialism, Morty laughed. One of those bubble-shaped chuckles young people make before responsibility tames them. Sure, Grandpa. He poured his own tea from a phantom pot that appeared precisely when needed. Its lid lifted itself obediently. The inn didn't bother hiding its magic. Steam curled upward, carrying soft fragrances of citrus and wood smoke. Rick took a sip and immediately tasted memories. Hillside laboratories, absent colleagues, the hum of machines when no one's speaking. Comfort and repentance balanced on his tongue. His voice came out quieter than expected. You know, Morty, most universes are just fancy excuses to keep having conversations like this. Morty swirled his tea, watching faint galaxies whirl within it. You mean the whole cosmic travel thing is just small talk with scenery? Exactly. The scenery listens better than people. They shared the kind of grin that collapses centuries between teacher and student. Outside, a wind lifted loose leaves along the eaves. Each rustle seemed to echo their thoughts before they said them. A minute passed, or maybe years. In timeless places, differences blur, then Morty's curiosity found its courage. When you're alone, he asked, what do you hear? You always look like you're listening to something no one else can catch. Rick studied the surface of his tea until its reflection returned his own uncertain eyes. Equations, he said softly. They hum under everything. People mistake them for silence. But sometimes... He stopped, searching for words gentler than honesty. Sometimes the songs get sad when I don't join in. Morty tilted his head. You mean like the universe misses your input? Maybe. Rick tapped the cup, watching tiny waves radiate. Or maybe it just likes arguments. He smiled faintly. We both like noise. Morty stared into his drink. For a long moment neither spoke, half hypnotized by the swirling warmth. Then something peculiar happened. Where Morty's spoon touched the tea, ripples formed shapes, curves of light, looping exactly like the infinity symbol Rick had once drawn for him in a lesson that was supposed to be about math, but ended up being about empathy. Grandpa, Morty whispered, is it supposed to do that? Rick leaned in. Nothing's supposed to. Everything's practiced. He set his own spoon against the bowl of the cup. The two liquids met across wood like synchronized thoughts. The patterns mirrored each other. For a moment the entire inn breathed in time with the twin ripples, walls subtly contracting and expanding. What's it saying? Morty whispered. Rick listened closely. Not words, feelings. It's turning our hesitation into music. We're basically duetting with physics right now." Morty's laugh broke the trance. The ripples collapsed, releasing a sound somewhere between a sigh and a chord resolving. "You always make it sound less meaningful when you explain things." "That's science, kid." "Best ruin beauty accurately," they laughed again. Conversation drifted after that. Nonsense, anecdotes, affection disguised as insult. Yet, below their words, a rhythm persisted, the quiet clink of porcelain under trembling hands, an alternate language built entirely in echoes. At one point, Morty grew reflective. "Do you ever think," he said, "that maybe kindness is how the universe recalibrates itself? Like when you forgive someone, maybe gravity realigns a bit." Rick blinked, genuinely startled by the elegance of it. "That's inconveniently profound. Might have to steal that line later. Just give me royalties," Morty teased, but his eyes stayed thoughtful. Rain began again outside, not the cleansing kind, just ordinary water doing honest work. It kissed the tavern roof with easy rhythm. Rick took the opportunity to pour a final cup and lifted it slightly in a toast. "To the noise between silences," he said. Morty touched his cup to the gesture, and to drinking it slow. They finished in companionable quiet. When the last drop was gone, a strange glow filled the cups. Looking down, they saw mirrored reflections, but this time Rick saw Morty's face in his, and Morty saw Rick's. In that shimmering half-mirror, the line between age and youth blurred until all you could see was recognition. The glow faded as naturally as breath. Their cups stood empty and ordinary once more. The inn's lamplight dulled, signalling respectful closing. Their chairs scraped softly against wooden floor. At the door, Morty paused, half in shadow. "You think we'll remember this conversation?" "Only when we miss each other," Rick said. "That's how memories apply for eternity. They send reminders disguised as longing," Morty grinned wistfully. "And I guess I'll have reminders forever." "And caffeine," Rick added. "Never underestimate caffeine." They parted with no handshake, no dramatic farewell. The bell chimed once. Outside, mist gathered at their ankles like a promise to meet again through some other improbable coincidence. Rick turned down a different road, his cup still warm in hand, though it held nothing. When he hovered it near his ear, he heard faint sloshing, a leftover echo purring contentedly. He smiled, tucked the cup into his coat, and whispered to the darkening path. "Good talk, kid. Good tea." The wind agreed, carrying the echo onward, until it faded into the hush of night. Another conversation stored gently within the sound of rain. Morning came with the feeling of déjà vu, lightly buttered onto the horizon. Rick woke before dawn, unsure if he'd actually slept or merely recycled a vivid rest. His teacup still sat by the bed, faintly glowing from the conversation it had overheard. Steam rose from it, though he hadn't refilled anything. "Persistent," he murmured, pocketing it like a pet with secrets. He followed a dirt road east until the sky brightened into something the color of forgiveness. Clouds hung soft as gauze, and the hum of the world gathered into direction. In the distance, a column of silver smoke twisted lazily upward, not dark, not dangerous, simply inquisitive. Curiosity pulled him closer until a vast building emerged, its walls glistening like wet film. Huge transparent panes shimmered faintly, catching fragments of memory that drifted through the air like dust. Over its gate, letters rearranged themselves every heartbeat before finally settling into two words: Memory Factory. Rick arched a brow. At least they're direct about it. A low, mechanical sigh answered, doors splitting apart, slowly inviting him inside. He entered. The interior looked less like industry, more like imagination overclocked. Enormous glass cylinders lined both sides of an endless corridor, each holding suspended scenes in liquid light. One jar contained a child's laughter. Another, the smell of burnt toast from a vanished apartment. Another, the whisper of waves that existed only on Tuesdays. Machines whirred softly, collecting stray thoughts adrift in the air, condensing them into glowing pearls before sorting them on conveyor belts labeled joy, regret, miscellaneous tenderness. He watched in curbed awe. The perfection of the place disturbed him. Memory was supposed to be smudged and human, not sterilized into catalogues. Still, there was beauty in the symmetry, like a brain trying on an angel costume. As he wandered, a figure approached, a woman entirely transparent except for her eyes, which glimmered with the colour of old photograph borders. She wore no badge, yet carried authority woven into her calm. "Welcome back," she said gently. Rick started. "Back? You were here once before you learned to doubt yourself," she replied.
"Everyone visits the first time they forget something worth keeping," he smirked.
"That must make your waiting room crowded." "We don't have queues here," she said. Memory prefers order over impatience. She gestured toward a row of cylinders labeled unclaimed happiness. Inside drifted scenes that looked oddly familiar. A porch at sundown, 2 mugs steaming unattended, a young voice shouting, "Grandpa, look!" Rick's throat tightened. "Those are unused versions of joy," she finished. "Moments you built but never inhabited." The words landed like gentle surgery, painless yet precise. "You mean this place bottles potential?" She nodded. "And sometimes sells it back as nostalgia. Travelers buy edited warmth when the real one feels too heavy."
"That's horrifying. It's lucrative." She smiled politely and continued down an aisle.
"Would you like to reclaim what you abandoned?" He hesitated. Logic barked, "Say yes." Pride muttered, "Consider the data." But intuition, the quiet voice taught by rain and tea, said, "Watch first." So he followed her deeper, where the machines grew subtler. Sleek mirrors bending memories into improved versions. On a nearby table lay a small cube labeled Rick Prototype. At 4:32, disturbingly, the cube emitted faint humming identical to his marble's song. He placed a hand on it. Light leaked through his fingers, showing a vision. Himself laughing without tension, Morty safe beside him, a future edited to remove every scar. It felt intoxicating, suspiciously wholesome. The curator's voice drifted over his shoulder. "Imagine living there, no burnouts, no guilt."
"Pure clarity," he frowned.
"Without mistakes, memory is fiction. We sell comfort, not truth." There it was, the fatal honesty of all perfection. He looked again at the cube's fake him. The smile was flawless, but thin as soap bubbles. He whispered, "The universe sleeps better when it's scarred." The curator tilted her head, curious. "You disapprove. Yet didn't you spend lifetimes constructing substitutes for emotion?"
"Liquids labeled validation."
"Devices for simulated intimacy." Rick chuckled, admitting defeat.
"Touché." Then quieter. "Maybe that's why I'm here, to dismantle my own bad habits." He lifted the cube and,
with surprising gentleness, set it against the side of a humming engine labeled emotional compressor. It sank through like stone through water. A faint exhale trembled through the factory walls. Screens dimmed. The perfection flickered, exposing patches of dust no one had noticed. The curator didn't move to stop him. She only watched, serene. "Rebellion through tenderness," she murmured. "That's new." Around them, stored memories began to melt back into air, thousands of tiny gleams floating upward like pollen of forgotten summers. They drifted out through ceiling vents, dispersing across the world to find their rightful owners. Outside, somewhere, people would sneeze unexpectedly and remember joy that hadn't visited in years. Rick leaned on a railing, eyes half closed, letting the golden storm brush his face. Each spark that passed through him carried whispers, voices thanking him in languages he didn't speak. For a moment he saw Morty as a child at the center of it all, holding handfuls of light like snowballs and tossing them into the sky. When the last of the glow had gone, silence returned, thick with the aftertaste of completion. The curator turned to him, transparent shoulders glimmering faintly. You've contaminated perfection with honesty. How do you feel? Taller, Rick said. Or maybe just less edited. She smiled as if approving of illness cured. Then take something to remember your relapse. She handed him a small vial labeled Authentic Memory. Handle with care. He pocketed it beside his marble. It clinked like two hearts deciding not to rush each other. Before leaving, he looked back once more at the shimmering corridors and murmured to the departing light, "Keep dreaming, but messier." The automatic doors breathed open for him. Outside, sunlight filtered through drifting particles of released memories, painting rainbows on the ground. People on nearby streets paused mid-step, smiling for no apparent reason. Somewhere, a baker started humming a tune she hadn't heard since girlhood. Rick stood in the glow, quietly proud of the disarray. The universe felt a little heavier, a little more real. Exactly how life should. He touched his pocketed vial. Warmth pulsed inside like heartbeat acknowledging another. Then he whispered, perhaps to the curator, perhaps to himself, "When nostalgia's honest, it stops pretending to be past." Behind him the factory dimmed, folding into ordinary steel. Only its faint heartbeat remained, a gentle, contented thrum, as if machinery itself were drifting into well-earned sleep. Rick turned toward the road. The marble hummed once. The kindness bell answered in harmony. Steam rose from the distant horizon, smelling faintly of brewed tea. He smiled at the connection. Always loops, always echoes, and stepped forward into the ripple of daylight, carrying imperfection like treasure. Rick had heard 1,000 sounds the universe could make, the hum of atoms, the chatter of galaxies, even the shy tremolo of raindrops falling through solid matter. But he had never heard silence yawn this wide. Morning refused direction. Wind drifted upward instead of sideways. Dust motes took their own conference in mid-air, ignoring furniture entirely. Gravity, the planet's most loyal employee, had apparently called in sick. He noticed it first when the spoon he stirred into his tea didn't stop stirring. It twirled cheerfully a few inches above the cup, scattering flecks of sugar-like glitter in slow water. "Oh," he sighed, rubbing his temple. "Day off for the universe's backbone. Fantastic." The floorboards beneath him shivered in sympathy, deciding to join the holiday. With a delayed wobble, the entire cottage, walls, chair, and the slightly startled inventor rose several feet into the air, buoyed by absence of purpose. Rick floated sideways until he could hook a knee around the doorframe. Outside, the world was full of elegant chaos, rivers curling into spirals of mist, hats ascending like confused birds, sheep practicing mid-air pirouettes. Nothing fell. Everything simply drifted. He laughed, partly because laughter gave momentum. "At least it's democratic." The marble in his pocket vibrated delightedly, and against his chest the kindness bell chimed a note that rose rather than rang. If metal could giggle, that's what it sounded like. He reached for his travelling notebook, which spun lazily in front of him. Every time he tried to write, his pen refused to cooperate. Ink forming perfect zero-gravity orbs that drifted toward the ceiling. He muttered, "Fine, no data today. We'll call it field observation through leisure." Down the hill, or what used to be down, villagers clung to fences that now served as handlebars for the sky. Instead of panic, most wore the wary delight of children suddenly excused from seriousness. Bread floated out of baskets, chasing birds that no longer bothered flapping. Tethered goats bleated contentedly, hooves pedaling in dreamlike rhythm. Rick drifted their way, using an overturned umbrella as both paddle and moral support. The closer he came, the lighter his heart felt, Not metaphor, but physics made literal. His chest rose enough that he had to occasionally exhale simply to stay near conversation level. "Morning." He called to a woman who was half reclining on a drifting hay bale. "Morning, stranger," she answered cheerfully, adjusting her skirt to preserve dignity in the absence of down. "Lost weight today, haven't you?" "About 100%, he quipped. "You folks all right?" "Oh, fine," she said. "We were frightened at first, but the school teacher invented cloud recess, and now everyone's too amused to worry." Indeed, above them a dozen children orbited the church spire like lazy comets, tossing pebbles and shrieking whenever one arced all the way around. Laughter travelled differently here, rounder, fuller, as if freed from memory's gravity too. Rick floated nearer, anchoring himself to a maple by looping a rope around its branches. The tree, apparently proud of new flexibility, obligingly bent toward him.
"Thank you," he told it.
The leaves rustled in modest applause. He produced his recorder and switched it on. The tiny device bobbed in front of his nose, spinning as it captured sounds. Boots scraping air, kettles sighing sideways, spontaneous joy unmoored from consequence. He realized the melody it collected was strangely harmonious. The universe, in taking a break, had composed a lullaby of gentle rebellion. Morty's voice flickered through the static of thought, half dream and half communication. "Everything okay out there, Grandpa?" Rick chuckled. "Define okay. Define Grandpa first," the voice teased back, then softened. "You sound happy." He considered denying it, but didn't. "Temporarily buoyant," he said. "Get some rest when you can. Even planets nap." The connection ebbed away, leaving only warmth behind. Afternoon arrived as a concept rather than a time. The sun drifted sideways too, a golden coin rolling lazily across sky's table. Without weight to pinch horizon, day extended like an endless sigh. People tethered their houses with ropes to keep memories from wandering off. Even arguments lost vigor, couples bickered mid-air, their words floating apart before landing harmlessly elsewhere. Rick settled near what used to be ground, and, after some confused wrangling, freed his flask from orbit. He poured a splash for himself, another for whichever cosmic principle might be eavesdropping. The liquid formed spheres between them. He clinked his against the larger one and murmured a toast to impermanence. Stay consistent at being inconsistent. He sipped, closed his eyes, and for the first time felt what it was like to understand equilibrium by absence. Gravity's departure had peeled noise from necessity, leaving motion without judgment. Everything moved simply because it could. After hours, or maybe seconds, the air thickened again. Toward the west, storm clouds gathered impatiently, tugged by some unseen supervisor demanding routine resume. One by one, objects began to remember their loyalties, pebbles drifting downward, rooftops settling with sighs of relief, hats repatriating to heads. Rick braced gently, hands out. "All right, folks, back to normal. Try not to bang into destiny too hard." The descent was slow and ceremonial, like a curtain of feathered gravity lowering itself after intermission. He touched down lightly in a meadow where cows were congratulating themselves for remaining largely upright. The marble pinged once, satisfied. The kindness bell chimed again, but lower this time, as if echoing the earth's relieved grunt. A young shepherd nearby, hat still floating a foot above his curls, looked at Rick wide-eyed. "Do you think it'll happen again?"
Probably, Rick said.
"When we forget how heavy we've been." The boy nodded solemnly, pretending to understand. As full gravity returned, fatigue replaced levity, pleasant, warm heaviness nesting in bones. People began sweeping not dirt, but sky dust from their homes. Laughter lingered in the corners like perfume. Rick walked the lane back toward his temporarily stationary cottage. Each step pressed tiny indentations into earth, newly eager to feel needed. He felt, oddly, the same way. When he reached his porch, the teaspoon from morning thudded gently onto the table, having finally decided to finish its drop. He smiled at it as though at an old comrade. "Good work, soldier." Take 5, he brewed fresh tea, mostly to remind continuity who was in charge. The first sip tasted unmistakably lighter, notes of altitude, echo of grace. Through the open window he could hear the town winding down, ropes tightening, laughter tapering off into lullabies. Rick leaned back in his chair and gazed out at a world that had just returned from vacation. There was bruised grass, scuffed air, a planetary stretch before settling back into duty. Every object seemed to breathe easier under its old weight. So did he. He lifted his mug and whispered, half prayer, half equation. "Thank you, gravity, for knowing when to let go." Night answered by scaling the last of the horizon, wrapping towns and thoughts alike in a friendly pull. The stars resumed their steady ticking, the patient metronome of routine. But beneath that rhythm lingered an aftertaste of freedom. The faint memory of floating, the reminder that weight itself had chosen them once and might do so again, only to teach gentleness. Rick smiled into darkness. "Lesson logged," he said. "Let's not wait another eternity for the sequel." The kettle sighed approvingly from the kitchen. He couldn't tell whether it meant agreement or exhaustion. Either way, he took it as consent, and somewhere invisible, a single droplet of the day's anti-gravity rain still hung motionless, unwilling to fall, keeping the memory of lightness safe until the next time the universe felt brave enough to rest. When morning slid back over the hills, it brought a clarity so clean Rick could almost hear the edges of the sunlight. The air after gravity's holiday felt newly rehearsed, each molecule reporting for duty with mild hangover but genuine gratitude. He brewed his tea, tasted the weight that had resettled into things and smiled. Stability sounded nice once in a while. The marble in his pocket rested quietly, storing the echo of yesterday's flight. The kindness bell, equally content, gave a small ping with each of his steps as though keeping time for invisible music. He followed the road east, drawn by a rumor he hadn't heard yet, which was always his favorite kind. The landscape changed slowly. Grass thinned into smooth stone, the gentle kind that once made waves beneath oceans before deciding to retire on land. Ahead, a valley opened into a mist so white it looked painted from the inside, and there, suspended impossibly across nothing, shimmered the bridge. It wasn't built from wood or rope, but from strands of light braided together. From a distance it had the look of spider silk after rain. Up close it resembled frozen breath.
No supports.
No obvious beginning. Just an arc from one bank to the other, gently pulsing. At the near edge, a small sign hung, hand-carved and polite. "Enter only if you mean what you say." Rick's lips twitched. "Well, that rules out half the species." Across the chasm, mist obscured the far side. He couldn't see who or what waited there. Still, compulsion nudged him forward. He placed one hand on the luminous rail. It was warm, alive, almost breathing. Behind his touch came a faint vibration, not mechanical, but moral. He whispered experimentally, "Travel safe." The bridge brightened slightly, approving. "Good morning." Another flicker, a happy chime. Then he murmured a sentence he didn't entirely mean, something conventionally polite.
Instantly, the light dulled, texture shifting beneath his palm like mild disapproval.
"Right," he sighed. Integrity test confirmed. Footstep by cautious footstep, he began the crossing. Each contact triggered soft tones, notes that lingered briefly before fusing into harmony. It felt less like walking and more like playing an instrument whose keys responded to sincerity. Halfway across, the marble in his pocket began to hum at matching pitch. He paused, hand over his chest.
"You singing along or warning me?"
The marble pulsed 3 times, the language they'd developed for both. Then a voice called from the other end. Young, familiar, tentative. "Grandpa, is that you?" "Morty." Rick blinked into the fog, which parted enough to reveal a silhouette about his height. Shoulders slouched in caution. It was him, but younger, and not the boy, but some grown iteration caught between confidence and care. The multiverse loved its metaphors, figures, Rick muttered. "Bridge of honesty, bring your better halves to workday." The younger self, perhaps another timeline's version, raised a hesitant hand. "You made it. Barely," Rick replied, attempting nonchalance.
"You look
"Less cynical, defect?" Other Rick smiled, faint and patient. "Upgrade, actually. The bridge only allows those who've learned to promise gently." Rick stuffed his hands into coat pockets. "And here I thought arrogance was currency." "It was," the other said, stepping closer. "Then we ran out of places to spend it." They stood a few yards apart, twin reflections inside liquidity of fog. The bridge vibrated beneath them, waiting for communication worth echoing. The younger man, or future self, nodded toward Rick's coat. "You still carry the marble? Wouldn't leave home without it. It remembers every vow you've kept." "It also remembers the ones you meant to," Rick frowned.
"And this whole structure runs on that sentiment?" "Exactly."
"Every promise ever whispered anchors a thread." The younger's voice softened. "It grows stronger only when people speak truthfully about fear." The realization hurt delicately.
Rick inhaled. "Fear, huh?"
"That's easy. I've got inventory." The bridge pulsed invitingly. He hesitated. Words, he knew, were heavy. Here, weight mattered. Finally, he spoke, voice barely louder than prayer. "I'm afraid of fixing everything but myself." Floor beneath his feet glowed brilliant gold. The tone it produced ran up his spine like forgiveness, tuned to frequency. C. Across from him, the other man closed his eyes and murmured, "Then progress begins." Rick chuckled, defensive as ever.
"That's simple."
"Always," came the answer. "But simple doesn't mean painless." He looked down. Beneath the light threads flowed the abyss, empty yet peaceful, as if tired of swallowing dramatics. A faint breeze rose, carrying the scent of tea, brass, and rain. Each chapter of his journey condensed into perfume. Morty's voice startled him again, not from the bridge, but from memory.
"Don't be scared, Grandpa."
"You already know how to cross things?" He smiled thinly. "Guess that's true." They walked toward each other until only a few paces separated them. The air between shimmered with tension created solely by unspoken sentences. Finally, Rick lifted his chin. "If you are who I might become, keep the sarcasm, all right?"
"It's ballast. I intend to," said the other version of him.
"But I traded the cruelty for curiosity. Lighter payload, good trade." They shared a small grin, the kind that erases decades of self-loathing in one blink. Then the figure began to fade, unraveling into lines of light that threaded themselves into the bridge itself. His voice lingered. "Every word you truly mean keeps someone else from falling." Rick nodded. "So does every silence we keep kindly." The bridge brightened fully now, solid as truth could ever hope to be. Mist thinned. Beyond it lay a meadow radiant with morning. Birds, freshly grateful for gravity, practiced honest flight. As Rick stepped off the final plank of light, it dimmed behind him. Content, he turned to watch it one last time. Where the two versions had stood glowed a single inscription handwritten across the air. "Promises break only when forgotten. Remembering is repair." He whispered the phrase aloud so the bridge could hear it once more, and the faintest tone answered, a note of continuity. Then the structure folded back into sunlight, dispersing upward like unneeded fear. On the meadow path, he found the bell and marble chiming together, performing a small duet in his pocket. The resonance warmed his ribs. He imagined Morty somewhere ahead of him, maybe practicing this same art, building smaller bridges in smaller hearts just by being gentle. Rick began walking again. His step lacked urgency but not purpose. Something in him had stopped leaning away from the world. For the first time, he believed that crossing didn't always mean leaving, that sometimes it simply meant joining everything you meant to say. He whispered to Horizon and himself alike, "All right, universe, one honest step at a time." The road ahead accepted the vow in silence that gleamed like applause. The world after the bridge felt washed by forgiveness. Rick noticed it in the air, a sweetness, a steadier heartbeat beneath the noise of crickets. Walking through morning mist, he kept feeling that maybe this would be one of those calm days that actually kept its promise. The road sloped into open fields of wheat, gone half silver, from moonlight left behind by dawn. Scattered clouds softened the horizon. Birds flew in slow arcs, the kind of circles patience makes when it has nowhere urgent to go. He walked without hurry and let the rhythm of his steps settle into the same compassionate tempo the bridge had taught him. Around noon, the light changed again. It grew warmer, denser, almost physical. Every surface glowed from within rather than reflecting. Even the stones seemed to remember summer and decided to give some of it back. He smelled rain, bread, and faint electricity, the combined perfume of home. Ahead, the path narrowed until it disappeared into the side of a hill veiled by honey-coloured radiance. He might have missed the door entirely if the marble in his pocket hadn't pulsed twice. He looked closer. Between two vines lay a shimmer, not quite shape, not quite illusion, an outline of vertical sunlight. When he stepped nearer, it quivered like a candle flame sensing breath. The hidden door in warm light, he realized. The one travellers spoke of, but never agreed where it truly stood. Gateway to memory, archive of hearts. He touched its surface. It wasn't solid so much as willing. It yielded like acceptance. At his touch, a faint tone spread, identical to the one the bridge had sung. Then the door opened inward, quietly courteous, revealing not darkness but layered brightness, gradations of gold leading deeper, as if distance itself had turned translucent. Rick hesitated only once. "All right," he said to curiosity itself. "But if this is a trap built of sentiment, keep it subtle." Then he stepped through. Warmth surrounded him. Not heat, exactly, but intimacy. The corridor beyond glowed with suspended motes of light, each a miniature scene playing softly inside. Nothing dramatic, just small, persistent tendernesses. A child tying a shoe, a friend waiting without checking the time. Light travelling through window glass, landing on leaves. Every flicker a quiet rescue of an overlooked miracle. As Rick walked, the lights rearranged themselves, forming a spiral downward. He heard footsteps echoing faintly behind him. He turned and saw Morty. The boy looked both exactly himself and faintly older, as if time here adjusted according to emotional truth rather than birthdays. "Grandpa," he breathed.
"I think the door followed me." Rick folded his arms, but his smile betrayed him.
Or maybe it just misses conversation. They stood side by side. The amber glow wrapped around them like shawl-thick sunlight. Even their shadows seemed relaxed. Ahead, the passage widened into a round chamber whose walls shimmered with living reflections. "Is this another one of your inventions?" Morty asked. Rick shook his head. "If I'd built it, there'd be an instruction manual and absolutely no sense of peace." In the center of the chamber stood a low, circular pool, not of water but pure light, its surface rippling every time they spoke. Across it, shapes began forming, phantoms drawn by recognition. On one side, they resolved into fragments of Morty's childhood, the summer he tried to teach worms to race, the look on his mother's face the day she realized he'd outgrown simple answers. On the opposite side, Rick saw his own younger selves, busy and brilliant, all hiding behind thin veils of sarcasm. Morty crouched beside the pool. "It's like the glass you made that showed feelings?" Rick nodded slowly. Maybe the glass grew up. They watched as memories from both lives drifted toward the center of the light until they overlapped, moments aligning like twin transparencies. There was the day Morty first called him Grandpa without hesitation, and behind it, the moment Rick had almost forgiven himself for deserving it. Two truths meeting at last. Morty glanced up. "It's showing both of us. But it's nicer than I remember." "That's because it's edited by kindness," Rick said softly. "Memory gets one free rewrite if love's paying attention." Morty stood, wiping at his eyes in quick embarrassment.
"Do you hear that hum?"
Indeed, a vibration filled the chamber, low, harmonic, like two hearts tuning to each other. Light rippled through the pool, reaching the walls, blending their reflections together until there was no clear separation between mentor and pupil, old and young. Rick exhaled. Guess the door wanted introductions to make sense. They stood quietly for long minutes. The light brightened, then began to cool toward silver. Shadows reclaimed outlines. Their reflections disentangled. The door behind them shimmered invitingly. Time to leave. Morty broke the silence. "Did we pass some kind of test?" "Maybe," said Rick, "but not the kind with grades. Doors like this only verify that you're still curious." As they stepped back through, the threshold released a sighing sound that could have been wind or gratitude. The hill outside waited, golden grass waving as if the landscape had witnessed their meeting and approved. Behind them, the doorway sealed itself, fading into sunlight until all that remained was a particularly warm patch on stone. Morty touched it once with his palm.
"It's still here," he said.
"We're just not supposed to stare too long." Rick nodded, remembering the message the clockmaker had murmured. "Use what the boy teaches you." "Lesson learned," he said under his breath. Morty looked at him, puzzled. "What lesson?" "That warmth isn't nostalgia, it's proof." They resumed walking down the slope. Birds clattered through weeds, scattering seeds like punctuation marks. The air hummed with quiet conclusion. Morty eventually asked, "Where are we going next?" Rick shrugged. "Wherever promises lead, after they're kept." The path wound toward a line of trees rippling under the new afternoon. Every leaf reflected a little echo of light, fragments the door had given back as souvenirs. Rick sensed they were carrying pieces of it with them, nested somewhere deep between memory and meaning. He didn't mind. Carrying warmth instead of guilt felt refreshingly scientific. Before the forest swallowed them, Morty turned to look once more at the hill. The light around it bent slightly, forming what could have been a doorway's outline.
Or maybe imagination refusing to close. He waved toward it like to a friend left behind.
"Thanks for letting us look," he said. Rick followed his gesture, whispering, "And for letting us go." They walked until dusk, carrying the glow on their shoulders. When night finally came, it came gently, as if afraid to disrupt their calm.
And miles away, deep under the hill,
the dormant door pulsed once with residual light, a steady heartbeat belonging equally to both of them. They camped beneath an orchard that hummed even when winds slept. Every branch, heavy with late fruit, released the scent of patient sweetness. Morty built a small fire, not from necessity but ritual, while Rick lay on his back with his coat for a pillow, staring at constellations that hadn't settled on their final arrangement yet. The air held that hesitant quiet the world makes when it's thinking about changing temperament. For a long time, neither spoke. Language, after all, had filled most of creation's to-do list already. The universe seemed to understand. It slowed with them, like a dancer waiting for her partner to remember the next step. Somewhere far beyond the orchard's reach, whole systems adjusted speed, planets pausing mid-orbit, moons drifting a little closer to the comfort of shine. Comets postponing their errands, Morty noticed the stillness first.
Grandpa.
Is it me or is everything holding its breath? Rick smiled without taking his eyes off heaven.
It's everyone.
We've been loud for quite a while. Guess the cosmos needed to inhale. The fire responded by lowering its own voice, flames shrinking into steady glow. Even the insects adapted, chirping at half tempo. They lay there another hour, letting the hush thicken around them until thought itself tiptoed. Finally, Morty whispered, "What happens if it never exhales?" "And we'll learn if peace has a heartbeat," Rick said. The grin with which he delivered the line softened the philosophy underneath. Truth was a luxury best taken funny side up. The stars above flickered, but lazily, as one blinks when drowsy rather than dying. Shapes rearranged, tracing loops Rick had seen in his notebooks for years. Figures of 8, circles chasing their halos. Only now they looked complete, as if the equations had tired of waiting in ink and decided to express themselves politely in light. The marble in his coat pocket began to pulse, matching that cosmic rhythm. He sat halfway up and held it to his ear. "Hear that, kid?" Morty rolled onto his side. "Sounds like waves. Or breathing, exactly. That's the dome of everything catching rhythm again. Remember Stilford? How the town dreamed in unison. Multiply that feeling by infinity, remove borders, sprinkle with ethics. That's what you're hearing." Morty nodded solemnly, as if the explanation required ceremony. "What if it falls asleep completely?" Rick chuckled. "And get some rest too. Stars look better from bed anyway." The boy drifted off minutes later, cheek against folded arms. Rick remained awake, cataloguing how much quieter the universe could get without ceasing to exist. Silence, he decided, wasn't absence but concentration. Every atom took a thoughtful pause before continuing its work. Every bit of light reconsidered which direction truly mattered. Across the orchard, time softened like wax. Dew formed on grass in slow motion. Somewhere, a fallen apple took nearly 10 minutes to reach the ground. When it did, the sound was more sigh than thud. Rick flipped it idly with his boot, thinking about gravity's recent nap, about bridges woven from promise, about glass doors teaching honesty to reflections. The pattern connected itself. The universe, like any living creature, was learning boundaries through rest. He poured himself half a cup of tea left from earlier. Steam rose reluctantly, taking its time to describe shapes before thinning into the air. For a breathless second he recognized one shape, a spiral identical to the clockmaker's pendulum, before it vanished. "Still supervising, huh?" he muttered affectionately into the dark. The answer came not from words but motion. An aurora unfolded from horizon to horizon, subtle as stretched silk. Its colors weren't the northern kind. These tones belonged to the vocabulary of warmth, copper, rose, dusk grey, and the gentle smoke blue of worn denim. The entire sky exhaled softly, and Rick felt wind comb his hair backward, like a patient hand. Morty stirred, gasping at the sight. "Whoa!"
Did we do that, us?
"Nah," Rick said, but his grin betrayed partial guilt.
Maybe we just stopped interrupting. They sat up side by side.
The aurora pulsed once, twice, as if listening for applause, then let its color spill slowly downward, bathing the world in mild phosphorescence. The orchard glimmered. Every apple became a tiny sun. Morty leaned close. "It's like the sky's breathing for real now," Rick nodded. "Give it time. Deep breaths after near eternity takes practice." He closed his eyes and synchronized his own breathing with the luminous rhythm overhead. Slow in, slower out. His heartbeat followed suit. It felt less like meditation and more like calibration. When he opened his eyes again, he realized something impossible. His cup of tea, half finished, hovered inches above his hand, perfectly level. Surface tension defied the returning gravity, motionless except for subtle ripples timed with his pulse. "Figures," he whispered to it. even caffeine's cooperating. The marble and bell joined the alignment. Faint light bled from his coat pocket like trust, leaking into the world. Every object he owned seemed to relax, screws undoing stress, lenses clearing from fatigue. He turned to Morty. "Kid, listen closely. What do you hear right now?" Morty frowned, focusing. "A hum, but not your usual gadget one."
Feels alive?
"That's the sound of everything forgiving everything else all at once." Morty considered, then nodded. "That's a lot to forgive." "Yeah," Rick said, "but it's a start." They watched as constellations altered their tempo from formation to easy sway, as though entire galaxies practiced slow dance. The universe had remembered choreography older than mathematics. Starlight reached Earth in rounded beams rather than sharp rays, and every edge in creation turned momentarily kind. Then gradually, motion resumed. Planets corrected their orbits, comets licked up forgotten gravity, mountains adjusted posture. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed with overly dramatic timing, pleased to announce morning's renewal. "Guess that's the exhale," Morty murmured. Rick laughed softly, a sound lighter than sarcasm.
And there's the universe, one song, finally hitting its next verse. He reached for his notebook.
But instead of equations, he began scribbling short sentences shaped like lullabies. "Breathe, world. You've earned it." He tore a page out, folded it into the shape of a star, and set it afloat on the quiet wind. It drifted upward, joined the fading glow, and vanished into returning daylight. Morty watched it go. "Do you think the universe reads?" "It skims," Rick answered. "But it remembers tone." The aurora dimmed to pale cream, leaving behind a feeling rather than color. Birds resumed chatter at normal rhythm. The orchard rustled with the relief of completion. One apple rolled lazily to Morty's boot. He picked it up, bit into it, and chuckled.
"Tastes like fresh start." Rick rested his head back on the grass.
"Keep chewing, then." They sat in gentle communion, the boy humming a tune learned from nowhere, the old man hearing the math behind it and deciding, for once, not to correct the tempo. Above them, the last echo of the aurora folded itself neatly into the sky, tucking light like a blanket around the sleeping daylight still waiting to wake. As they packed to leave, Rick glanced upward one final time. The stars, faint but present, blinked twice, the universal equivalent of a nod. He returned the gesture with slight salutation and said, from the full weight of fatigue mixed with peace, "Good nap, Cosmos. Welcome back." The universe, freshly rested, kept breathing. So did he. Night returned as slowly as a thoughtful idea. While Morty slept beside the remnants of the fire, Rick wandered off into the orchard where shadows had begun to fold themselves neatly between trees. The moon hung low and wide, glowing the soft yellow of candle wax. He walked until even the smallest trace of path gave up. The air thickened, humming low. His boots barely made sound, as if reality remembered that silence had become its favorite instrument. He felt it first, rather than saw it. The sense of extra presence, thin as memory but somehow heavier. Turning, he found a clearing lit from below, not above. Faint light rose from the ground, forming a halo around a figure sitting cross-legged amid fallen apples. The boy couldn't have been more than 13. Tangled hair, coat too big for his bones, eyes reflecting dew. A version of him frozen at the exact age when curiosity outweighed conscience. The boy looked up and grinned. "Took you long enough," he said. Rick studied his younger self, uncertain which emotion demanded priority.
"Amusement one. You sound smug for someone without facial hair. You sound tired for someone who won." Rick raised an eyebrow.
"One, you should look at my resume again," the boy shrugged. "You made it further than I did."
"I'm just the arrow mid-flight." Rick eased down opposite him, knees protesting.
and I guess this is the target. They sat within arm's reach, mirror and memory. The marble in Rick's pocket warmed. The bell gave one tentative ring, sensing reunion. Fireflies spun careless orbits overhead like static caught on time's sleeve. "So," the older one began carefully, "what's this about? You come to haunt me into nostalgia." "You came here," said the boy.
"I'm just where you left the questions." Rick smirked, but said nothing. The boy plucked an apple from the grass, turning it slowly in his hands.
"Why'd you stop building things that sang?"
"I didn't stop," Rick replied quickly.
"I just built quieter models." "Too quiet," said the boy, and bit into the apple. The crunch sounded impossibly loud in the heavy air. Juice ran down his wrist like liquid moonlight. Remember how equations used to taste? Sweet, messy, like invention before disappointment set in? "I also remember exploding prototypes and insomnia," Rick said. "Fair trade," the boy answered with a teasing smile. "You used to believe mess was sacred," Rick rubbed the back of his neck. The knight listened politely.
"I grew up."
"Someone had to aim for precision." "Precision's fine," the boy said, "as long as it doesn't replace wonder." A long pause settled between them. The orchard sighed, each tree releasing small echoes that sounded vaguely like agreement. Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You at that age couldn't imagine why I'd trade wonder for certainty." "Try me," the boy said, chewing thoughtfully. "All right."
"'Cause it hurt watching things break."
"Because caring takes time I didn't think I had. Because the universe rarely thanked effort," he exhaled. "So I built fences out of equations. Safer that way?" The younger version tilted his head. "Safer isn't the same as alive," that answer landed. Rick pressed thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. "You're remarkably insufferable when you're—"
"Right." The boy grinned, a gesture that once belonged to innocence,
but now looked foreign on an older
face that admitted it's still in there somewhere.
The part that hums when something new exists. A small breeze idled through, lifting a few apple blossoms into low orbit. They circled the pair like the slow hands of an unseen clock. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Rick sighed. "You really think I can rewind passion just by showing up here?"
"Not rewind," said the boy, standing.
"Remember forward. The difference between equations and lullabies is purpose. You used to solve for connection, not control." The orchard light brightened briefly as though the statement resonated with its roots. Fruit shivered on branches but didn't fall. Everything waited for honesty's follow-through. Rick rose too, face tilted slightly toward the same illumination that made the boy almost transparent now.
"A sketch drawn in luminosity. You're fading." "That's how memory works," said the boy.
"But before I go, answer one last thing." His tone softened, almost pleading.
"Did we ever become kind?"
The question floated between them like a dandelion seed refusing ground. Rick opened his mouth, found himself unable to lie. "On good days," he said finally.
"And the rest of the time we keep trying," the boy smiled, a real full expression of belief.
That counts. When the light around him began to dissolve, it carried his voice like a promise. Don't stop trying. The stars remember effort more than outcome. Then the clearing dimmed. The phosphorescence sank back into soil, leaving Rick alone with the ordinary moon and the faint tick of a world recomposing itself. He stayed there a while, unsure whether gratitude or grief weighted his breath more. Eventually he sat cross-legged in the same patch the boy had occupied. The grass was still warm. Inside his chest, fatigue turned into something quieter. Equilibrium. He pulled out the marble and held it to the starlight. Its glow rippled, replaying faint images, young hands covered in graphite, early experiments made of laughter and impatience, the spark that started it all. The sight hurt beautifully. Rick spoke down to the earth as though it were listening. "We did become kind enough sometimes, kid. That'll have to be legacy." Wind stirred the orchard again, arranging branches into applause. He chuckled, wiping a suspicious sting from his eye. Okay, Point conceded. When he returned to camp, Morty was awake, sitting up in his blanket, silent but aware. Everything all right? The boy asked. Rick lowered himself to the ground beside him.
I had a talk with a bad influence, Morty smiled sleepily.
He win? Rick looked at the horizon where dawn considered stretching. We called it a draw. They let silence finish the conversation. The air still felt charged, but not restlessly, like an orchestra between movements. Rick realized his shoulders no longer carried their usual ache. Even his thoughts had softened edges. The first light of morning filtered through the orchard, painting their faces in pale gold. He watched it spill across Morty's hair, warming everything it touched, and finally whispered, "You were right, old man." Morty blinked. "Which old man?" "Me," Rick said, smiling tiredly. "And you'll be one too someday. Try to outkind me when you get there, yeah?"
I'll try. The sun lifted itself fully then, turning dew into sparks.
Rick tilted his head back, greeted that inevitable warmth with the heart of someone who'd just finished forgiving himself through conversation. Above them, a single apple dropped from a high branch, landed softly in grass between them. Neither moved to claim it. It belonged to both forms of him now, past and present, young and older, joined politely in truce. The dawn after the orchard arrived like a shy apology, pale light easing itself through mist as if hesitant to wake anyone. Rick and Morty walked side by side along a road that didn't seem entirely convinced it needed to lead somewhere. Pebbles rolled ahead in playful rebellion. Grass bent toward them like listeners. The world had adopted a new rhythm, an unhurried pulse that wasn't measured in seconds but in sincerity. "You notice?" Morty said. "How days feel longer since the bridge." Rick nodded. "That's what happens when time stops pretending to be a ruler and starts acting like water." Morty frowned, trying to translate.
"So it flows?"
"It swirls," Rick corrected with half a grin. "Every now and then it calms enough to see your own reflection. That's when you learn, if you're paying attention." They stopped on a ridge where the remains of a watchtower leaned like a dozing giant. Around it, fields rolled into a haze of midday, warm and gold. Rick set down his pack and stretched, feeling the now familiar tug of relaxed gravity. The marble clicked in his pocket, signaling curiosity. The little kindness bell offered a faint chime in sympathy. "Kid," Rick said, seating himself on an old stone. "We've been running on calendar time. Linear, efficient, exhausting. The universe doesn't breathe that way." Morty sat opposite him, cross-legged and open-mouthed in that half-polite awe only grandsons and lecture audiences share. Rick drew lines in the dust with a twig. Circles, spirals, waves. "This," he said, pointing to the circles, "is soft time. It doesn't ask where you're going. It asks whether you've learned to pause. See, the trick isn't moving forward. It's returning differently." Morty nodded slowly, eyes tracing the gentle pattern.
"So at every time loops but improved?" "Exactly." Rick leaned back, satisfied.
"Evolution's a fancy word for better reruns." A breeze rose, carrying the smell of dew and old machinery. The sound reminded them both of earlier worlds, metal and wonder and fatigue. Here, though, the air had patience. Even their shadows seemed relaxed, spreading thin but not hurried to depart. Morty picked up the twig.
"Can I try?"
"Be my guest." The boy drew his own shape, a meandering line that refused to meet itself.
"Mine's not looping. It just drifts," Rick smiled. "Congratulations."
"You've invented narrative," Morty laughed, embarrassed. "You mean that's okay? Time doesn't shame creativity," Rick said. "Only deadlines do." They sat in comfortable silence. From the valley came the faint sound of a bell, perhaps another version of the kindness bell ringing from a pocket of possibility. The tones spread outward until even the wind tuned itself to the note. Rick closed his eyes.
"You hear it again, don't you?"
"The humming thing?" "Yeah, the universe checking its own pulse." Morty leaned back on his elbows. It's kind of nice that it still has one, Rick chuckled. Better than some scientists I know. Afternoon leaked into afternoon. Time ceased keeping tidy edges. They wandered through the fields, every step potentially an hour or a memory. Crossing a small stream, Rick noticed his reflection ripple but not return to normal. Instead, it lingered, showing him 5 versions of himself at various ages, each thinking he had more control than he truly did. The vision faded with a chuckle from the water. He dipped a hand to drink. The stream was cool and oddly resonant, liquid ticking gently. Soft time, he realized, flows like this, never denying nostalgia but refusing to drown in it. He motioned for Morty to join. They cupped water together, watched droplets cling to their palms instead of falling. A single bead hovered between them, trembling, mirror bright. "What's it waiting for?" Morty whispered. Rick shrugged. "Maybe permission." They leaned close until breath alone nudged the droplet free. It drifted skyward, tiny silver planet seeking its orbit. Morty grinned. "Guess even water needs time off." "Everything does." They continued until twilight painted the sky proportional to peace. Birds performed low-tempo choreography. Distant towns lit lanterns one by one, slow pulses of amber flickering in sequence like the heartbeat of civilization. Rick began talking again, not lecture this time, more confession. "You know, kid, when I first measured light speed, I thought precision made permanence. Turns out the more exact, the quicker things fade. Maybe uncertainty's the glue that holds memory together." Morty nodded, attentive. "So we should keep a little mystery. Always curiosity's caffeine for existence." He looked at his watch, then laughed when he remembered it no longer ticked. The second hand had long since decided retirement suited it. "See? Even my watch's learning boundaries." Morty examined his own wrist, bare, unadorned. "Guess I'm on cosmic time already." They both laughed quietly. Above, clouds rearranged themselves into slow spirals mirroring the dust designs Rick had drawn. Reality imitated metaphor for once and didn't seem embarrassed about it. As evening deepened, they made camp in a field of luminous wildflowers. Each blossom opened only when looked at directly, then closed just as politely when eyes wandered elsewhere. A perfect metaphor for memory, Rick decided, the world revealing truths only when respected by attention. He lit the stove. Blue flame reflected in his glass lenses, 2 tiny planets hovering before universes of fatigue. "Time wants gentleness," he said after a while.
"Not control, not applause?"
"Just patience." Morty poured water, nodding.
"Like people, huh?"
Rick smiled, a small one, genuine. "Exactly like people." Steam rose around them, curling upward in slow repetition, creating the illusion of minutes passing. Each curl looked like a question mark, softening back into answer. When the water settled, they drank quietly. "Grandpa?" Morty asked eventually. "Do you ever wish you could speed it again? The research, discoveries, everything?" Rick stared into the flame.
"Sometimes.
But then I remember how easily speed becomes noise. Silence is where most discoveries hide, waiting for us to slow down enough to notice them waving." Morty twitched his lips into a thoughtful half-smile. "Guess the universe likes slow learners. That's the only kind it created." They ate dinner while constellations rearranged themselves overhead, tracing invisible staves of music. The night had rhythm rather than time now. Even the stars appeared to breathe on cue. When Rick checked the sky through his small telescope, he saw galaxies pivoting minutely, as if exhaling synchronized gratitude. He lowered the lens and whispered, half to the universe, half to the boy. "Good.
That's good."
Keep breathing that way." Morty, eyes heavy with sleep, mumbled, "You talking to me or space?" "Both." When the kettle whistled softly, he turned it off. The air pulsed, satisfied. Rick lay back, hands folded under his head. "Lesson 1, he said into the growing dusk. "Time isn't a bully, it's a teacher who grades mercifully slow." Morty, half asleep, murmured, Lesson 2. Kindness is how we pass the course. The answer earned a tired laugh, then a yawn. The fields around them breathed, wind swaying flowers into waves. Within each petal's glow, Rick thought he saw small fractions of moments they'd lived before, replayed softly so no one would forget. He closed his eyes. The marble pulsed once, the bell twice, and the gentle current of soft time wrapped around both travelers like a melodic blanket. Tomorrow could take its time arriving. Tonight had nowhere better to be. They woke under a velvet dawn stitched with early birdsong, each note so deliberate it felt rehearsed by the cosmos itself. Soft time had stretched the night rather than erased it. The world inked itself gently into morning, mindful not to smear yesterday's quiet. Rick sat up first, rubbing sleep from his face, noticing how light pooled differently now, rounder somehow, as if even sunlight had been moved by their patience. "Morning, kid," he mumbled. Morty yawned. "What time is it?"
No clue, said Rick, amused.
"My watch retired," he shrugged.
Probably time for something final. That word hung in the air. Not ominous, just inevitable.
The marble in his pocket agreed with a faint flicker. The bell chimed once, a polite ready. They followed a footpath toward a distant plateau. The earth climbed softly, never hurrying them. At the summit, a wide plain opened, sweeping far enough to see curvature. It looked perfectly suited for last gestures. Wind met them warmly. Against the horizon stood a ridge of black stone polished by aeons. Rick ran a palm across its smoothness. It hummed back like tuned glass. "This will work," he said. "For what?" Morty asked, squinting. Rick unpacked his notebook, stub of pencil, and a sliver of chalk the colour of frost. "For finishing a thought I began when everything was still loud." He crouched near the rock, drawing symbols that looked part mathematical, part musical. Circles nested within other circles, faintly glowing as he traced them. Each stroke released a sound, not mechanical, but alive, low chords made from air, remembering form. Morty watched, transfixed. "You're writing in music?" Rick didn't look up.
"I'm writing in kindness," the boy blinked.
"Kindness is measurable, only if you believe it cares enough to be measured. Lines connected, spiraled, intertwined." Before long, the flat plane of equations curved, forming something more sculptural than written, a luminous helix that looked half molecule, half lullaby. "This," Rick said quietly, "is what I used to chase." But chasing was the mistake. Morty moved closer. "What does it do?" Rick smiled wistfully. "Maybe nothing."
That's what makes it perfect.
All equations before this tried to solve. "This one listens." He rose, leaving the chalk to roll away on a small breeze. The marks glowed brighter, pulsing with the faint rhythm they had carried across galaxies. Each symbol emitted colour, silent blues and forgiving ambers, spilling across the plateau like slow fireworks trapped beneath gravity's modest rule. Morty whispered.
"It's beautiful." "Yeah," Rick said softly.
"Probably useless too, but beauty's what function looks like when it stops marketing itself." They stood together in the wind. After a moment, Morty spoke again, voice careful. "What's it supposed to mean, though?"
"Every line looks familiar," Rick nodded.
"It should. These curves, see the wide ones? That's empathy expanding. The loops here are patience learning to overlap. And the final spiral?" He trailed off, crouched again, drawing one last smooth curve connecting every symbol into infinite motion. "That's forgiveness closing the circuit." As the line touched itself, light erupted, not blinding, only profound. It rolled outward, a pulse smoother than heartbeat, spreading across horizon until even the sky seemed briefly affected. Clouds aligning into mirrored spirals before drifting back into their own agenda. Morty stepped backward instinctively.
"Grandpa, what did you do?"
Rick shielded his eyes, even though nothing harmful shone. "Balance the equation." Not for mass or energy, just emotion all around them. Small reactions rippled. Flowers pivoted toward one another instead of the sun. Pebbles rolled closer as if tired of solitude, and the wind began carrying echoes of countless unspoken apologies whispered across distance. Morty felt tears welling up for reasons too large to name. "It's like everything's remembering we're all the same story," he said. "Pretty much," Rick murmured.
"I just gave math a conscience." He tore a page from the notebook, scribbling the shape again fast in miniature.
Then he slipped the scrap into Morty's pocket. "If the universe forgets again, this pattern, will you?" Morty looked down, uncertain.
You're not planning on disappearing or anything, right?"
Rick chuckled, weary but genuine.
"No dramatic exits."
Final equations aren't endings, they're lullabies to keep chaos asleep. The plateau shimmered faintly. Wind changed direction, then stilled, respecting ceremony. Rick exhaled slowly, every cynical defense he'd ever worn, loosening and falling invisible to the ground. What replaced them was almost youth again. Not naivete, but uncluttered belief. "Morty," he said, "look close. See how each glow fades just a bit? That's because understanding's supposed to fade."
"Otherwise we'd stop asking." He sat down cross-legged before the luminous spirals.
Morty joined him, mimicking the posture. Together they listened. The equation emitted a hum, quiet and persistent, stretching beyond hearing rather than disappearing. It was the universal pitch of comfort, what silence sounds like when proud of itself. After a long while, Morty spoke. "Do you ever get scared we'll forget today?" Rick shook his head. "You can't forget resonance? You might lose lyrics, but melody's permanent." Morty nodded, relief mixing with awe. "What happens now?" "Now," Rick said, leaning back to look at the endless sky, "we let the universe dream without supervision." He pulled the kindness bell from his pocket and set it on one of the glowing circles. It chimed once, perfectly in tune. The note travelled outward, merging with the hum, until both became impossible to separate. The sound of neutrality turned loving. Morty noticed the marble vibrating too. It rose from Rick's coat, hovered above the equation,
absorbed light like breath, and then gently cracked open, not shattering but blooming, revealing inside a speck of stardust the size of yes. Rick laughed softly. "I guess it graduated." The light folded inward, all brightness gathering into the single small particle.
It drifted toward the sky and vanished, leaving only dusk's quieter color behind. The plateau now bore no scorch, no residue, just faint warmth underfoot, like sunlight stored below stone. Rick brushed his hands on his knees. "Back to work," he said rhetorically, then corrected, "Back to peace." They began descending toward the valley. Morty glanced over his shoulder. The plain seemed unchanged, yet he felt the arithmetic of it vibrating inside him, every heart a digit of the same slow sum. At camp, Rick filled their cups with water turned silver by the new light. They toasted in silence. When Morty finally set his cup down, the ripples inside formed small infinity signs that overlapped before fading. Rick noticed, smiled, said almost to himself, "Guess the lesson stuck." As night approached, stars emerged earlier than expected, yet shone softer, as if tired of proving bravery. Each pulse above mirrored the tempo of the hum, still living in their bones. Morty fell asleep, leaning against his shoulder. Rick watched him for a while, the faint glow of both their reflections mirrored in the cup's surface. Then he closed his eyes, murmuring to the darkness that had stopped being a threat. Everything's connected, even goodbyes, the universe, still humming the completed formula. Agreed. By the time the plateau faded behind them, the world had gone faintly gold again, a quieter version of sunrise that seemed to apologize for all previous dramatics. Rick and Morty walked until the air itself began to smell like home, warm metal, crisp tea leaves, and the familiar tang of unfinished experiments, the path spiraled gently downward through fields of shimmering grass. Every blade reflected fragments of the equation they had left behind. Wherever the wind bent a stalk, a trace of pale blue light lingered for an instant before dissolving. It felt like the planet whispering, "We understood." Morty broke the long hush first. "Grandpa, are we done now?" Rick, dragging his fingers across tall grass as if searching for leftover numbers, answered, "That's the wrong word."
Nothing's done. It's just...
Well rested. They reached the outskirts of a small town he half remembered, one of those locations memory visits more than maps do. The streets were curved pleasantly, like smiles left behind by architecture. Jars of fireflies lined stoops instead of lamps. People there waved with the languid grace of those who no longer rushed their own stories. They rented a modest room above a bakery. From the open window drifted the scent of rising dough and sugar muted by distance. Morty threw his pack onto the only chair.
Rick unfolded his notebook on the table, though the pencil he used sat idle. "You thinking?"
Morty asked. "Mostly digesting," the boy laughed. "Of the food of the universe." "Same thing now," Rick replied with a smirk. He looked around the tiny room. Everything there seemed content with its simplicity. 2 mugs, a small kettle, a bed wider than logic. It was the kind of place built for pauses. Without over-announcement, he set water to boil. The faint hiss filled the room like memory rehearsing its entrance. They shared tea at the window as twilight expanded outward in perfect, slow ellipses. Below them, street music drifted, the kind played not for applause but for company. Morty rested his chin on his hand, watching the sky bruise itself into plum and navy. "Do you ever want to go back?" he asked. "To where?" "All the places that felt exciting before we got soft," Rick chuckled.
"Soft isn't surrender, kid."
"It's armor turned breathable. But don't you miss adventure?" He took a thoughtful sip.
"Adventure's just rest wearing a disguise."
"Sooner or later, you realize every explosion ends in quiet anyway." Morty seemed to turn that over. In silence, the kettle clicked off. Rick poured another round purely for ceremony. The steam rose between them in loose ribbons, and again, as it had done in other worlds, light bent through it to compose temporary shapes, circles, bridges, the faint outline of a clock. "Everything we built keeps waving goodbye," Morty said softly. "That's how you know it's working," Rick answered. "Creation has to leave to prove it's alive." Later, as lamps lit the street below, Rick grew restless. He stepped outside onto the narrow balcony, leaning on the railing worn smooth by years of other forearms and other good nights. The town buzzed quietly beneath, laughter from a tavern, footsteps with unpretentious rhythm, the clink of someone washing dishes 2 streets over.
Mundane holiness. For the first time, he felt genuinely equal to the background rather than above it.
That, he decided, was the true reward of age, becoming part of the mural instead of the graffiti. Morty joined him, chewing on the crust of bread, scavenged from their earlier supper. "You're smiling," he said. "You usually only smile when something's on fire." "Growth hurts, doesn't it?" Rick replied dryly, then added, "Sometimes it heals, though." They leaned there together. The conversation drifted toward irrelevance. Which constellation looked most like an eyelash? Whether sandwiches counted as philosophy? How many stars probably carried older versions of the same talk happening right now? Each subject ended the same way, with laughter that didn't need to be loud to feel true. When the night cooled further, they went back inside, leaving the window open so starlight could visit. The room filled with the slow rhythm of distant tides, that particular pulse oceans develop when planets are happy. Morty curled into sleep almost immediately. Travel always spent his energy faster than wonder could replenish it. Rick remained at the table, pencil finally moving again. On the page, he wrote no scientific notation, only a single line repeating down the sheet. "Thank you for the noise, world. I learned to echo softly." He tore the page free, folded it, and set it beneath the cooling kettle. Outside, a soft wind slipped through the window and carried the scent of baking bread and the low hum of contentment. He listened as the town itself breathed, every chimney sighing in unison, every house creaking like an organism just falling into dream. Near midnight, the marble stirred one last time. Its light pulsed gently from the bedside table. The kindness bell rang a quiet answer. Rick understood without needing translation. "Time?" he asked aloud to the room. A steady hum served as confirmation. He walked out into the corridor, down the stairs, through the sleeping bakery's sweet air, and onto the street. The entire sky rested on its back, showing him sequences of elder starlight, those soft mathematical scars the universe wears proudly. He reached the fountain at the center square and sat on its edge. Water winked moonlight at him. He pulled another folded paper from his notebook, the scrap that held Morty's miniature drawing of the final equation. Folding it twice more, he dropped it carefully into the fountain. The ripples expanded outward, glowing briefly before fading into the water's dark. No fireworks, no cosmic applause, just completion. Behind him, Morty's sleepy voice drifted from the doorway.
"I can't even throw a note in a fountain without making it poetic, huh?"
Rick turned, smiling crookedly. Old habits float, Morty joined him on the rim. Together they watched the reflection of stars tremble across the fountain's surface. "So is this the part where we go somewhere new?" the boy asked. Rick shook his head. "Nah, first we stay. Goodbye's not leaving.
It's noticing that you can." Morty nodded, half understanding, half accepting that understanding could come later. They lingered until first light rinsed the rooftops in gold.
Birds started their ordinary concert. Bread ovens below began to warm again. The smell of day returned. Rick stood, stretching. "Time for bed, kid?" "We've survived another miracle," Morty grinned through a yawn.
"Good night, that's pretending to be morning." "Exactly." Back upstairs, the room was tender with dawn.
Rick poured what little tea remained into both cups. They drank in unison, neither saying anything. The silence between them had matured into understanding. It no longer demanded filling. After a while, Morty's eyes drooped. The cup slipped from his hands onto the blanket, but didn't spill. Gravity itself seemed protective. Rick set it aside and pulled the curtain half closed. Sunlight sliced across the floor, tracing a line exactly where the final equation would have glowed if the room could remember it. He whispered into that line, almost reverently, "All right, universe, it's your turn to talk." The air brightened,
answering with the gentlest rustle, a sound that might have been words, might have been thanks.
Rick lay back, exhaling fully for once. The good goodbye had already happened, slow, shared, unurgent. What remained was only rest, wrapping both travelers in light warm enough to keep promises asleep. For once, morning broke gently enough not to startle anything. Sunlight strolled in rather than spilled, poking at the curtains as if asking permission first. Rick blinked awake to find Morty still sleeping, curled around a pillow that had somehow captured the scent of all their journeys. Rain, tea, and a hint of cosmic dust. He sat at the bedside for a long while without moving. His body felt anchored, in the pleasant way roots hold a tree when wind decides to rest. The quiet wasn't hollow, it was full of presence, and he knew unmistakably that this was where a story ends only by remembering it's allowed to continue quietly inside whoever hears it. On the table beside him lay remnants of their travels, the marble, dull now but still warm, the tiny kindness bell, a field map annotated in equations that no longer needed solving. Each object seemed aware of its nearing sleep. Their hums had faded into something subtler. Not silence, more like the faint sigh a page makes when turned carefully. He poured a cup of water instead of tea. The simple, cool clarity suited the day. Taking a sip, he whispered toward the half-open window. "You awake, old friend?" The world answered by breathing. A drifting breeze that carried the smell of fresh bread from downstairs, followed by a scatter of birds rising effortlessly. Gravity had rehired itself, but kindly this time. Rick smiled at that small mercy. He dressed, careful not to wake Morty, and stepped onto the balcony. From here, the town hummed in subdued harmony. Shopkeepers lifted shutters slowly as if afraid to disturb the balance of air. The fountain in the square mirrored the newborn sun. Faint ripples, the ones that carried his note yesterday, were still visible like a heartbeat the city had decided to keep. He leaned on the railing and let memory line up beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the paused night of the universe, the town that dreamed, the rain that fell through everything, that ridiculous day without gravity, and the final equation blooming on an endless plateau. Each recollection arrived not as image but as texture, the feeling of wonder folded into calm. A yawn behind him. "You couldn't wait till breakfast for nostalgia?" Morty mumbled, padding barefoot across the floor. Rick chuckled. Trying to beat the crowd, Morty joined him, squinting into the gold light. For a minute they did nothing except breathe in the fragile whole piece of an ordinary day. "Feels weird," Morty said softly. "Like the world's been washed and hung out to dry," Rick nodded. "That's what renewal smells like."
Bit of soap, bit of surrender. Are we
"Done travelling?" he thought before answering. "Done chasing? Never done noticing?" Morty grinned sideways. "That's a nice retirement plan sentence." They laughed quietly together. A sound that fit the morning as well as sunlight fits water. By noon, they wandered through the village, blending into its hum of routine. The baker refused their coin and instead handed them a loaf the shape of gratitude. At the square, a child, no older than Morty once had been, played with a tin bird that hovered sideways, a familiar model, still spinning wrong and perfectly. Morty shot Rick a look.
You left your mistakes everywhere, didn't you?
"Better than monuments," Rick admitted. "Monuments don't giggle." They sat by the fountain. The marble in his pocket vibrated once more. A final flutter. He drew it out. Light fractaled briefly inside, then settled into transparency. "Batteries run out," he murmured. "Or mission accomplished." Morty extended a hand.
Can I have it?
Rick placed the no longer glowing orb into his palm. "Sure. You'll find use for remembering curiosity when it stops showing off." Morty rolled it between his fingers, smiling at its simple, unmagical weight.
I'll keep it safe. You already do,
Rick said quietly. The boy looked puzzled until he realized his grandfather wasn't talking about the marble. Afternoon stretched like deliberate handwriting across the sky. Time, true to its soft lessons, refused any urgency. They helped the baker stack warm loaves, listened to travelers describe faraway harvests, and watched light change hue as if the sun were practicing its exit lines. When shadows lengthened, they returned to their balcony. 2 mugs waited because the innkeeper had anticipated ceremony. Neither tea nor speech were necessary anymore, yet repetition itself felt holy, so they filled the cups and toasted once more. "To what now?" Morty asked. Rick considered. "To the part of stories that keeps going when both readers fall asleep." They drank. The warmth slid through them politely, as if not to interrupt the day's graceful cooling. Evening arrived, wearing silence like silk. The first star appeared, shy but determined. Morty leaned back against the wall. "Do you think that one's watching us?" "All of them are."
They owe me royalties, Rick said deadpan.
The answer earned a laugh so honest he wished he could bottle it. Then Morty asked, "What do we do tomorrow?" Rick looked out at horizon. "Same as always. Learn how to stay." The boy accepted that without question. It was clear he finally understood adventure, and rest were the same thing practiced at different tempos. When night deepened, they still hadn't gone inside. The sky above was vast, freshly repaired. Stars exhaled in tandem. Crickets unpaused their choir. The universe appeared to have settled into a long, content sleep cycle. Rick felt the gentle pull of fatigue, not from exhaustion, but peace. "Well," he said, voice low, "looks like the finale didn't change much after all." Morty turned to him.
You serious?
Rick nodded toward the heavens. "Everything's still infinite, just a little kinder." "That's plenty?" Morty smiled, head tipping back against the wooden wall. "Kind is enough, yeah." The conversation melted into open air. With no more words collecting behind his teeth, Rick simply listened. Tonight, to heartbeats, to the even breathing of a boy who had become his quietest proof of something working. The pulse of existence slowed until every sound synchronized. The fountain's burble, the whisper of leaves, even his own exhale finding rhythm with cosmic breath. He murmured toward the stars. "We did okay, didn't we?" A passing breeze curled around the balcony and replied in rustling syllables. "You did." Rick closed his eyes, smiling. The room behind smelled faintly of warmth and future. Somewhere a clock ticked, but kindly, each second released into the next without regret. When sleep finally came for both of them, it came as continuation rather than end. Dreams fluttered through open windows like postcards from across time, the bridge gleaming above mist, rain flowing through ceilings, towns laughing in their sleep. The memories queued politely to visit before folding themselves into rest. Outside, the stars relit one by one, remembering their names from the first chapter. Their music, half science, half lullaby, spread outward through everything that could still feel. And in that soft infinity, two travelers lay easy within the patterns they had helped restore, breathing exactly in time with creation's patient heart. Long after the fountain stopped rippling, the faintest glow remained above the little town, a seam of light stitched neatly between horizon and possibility. By then everyone had gone indoors, unashamed of sleeping. Only the sky stayed awake, reviewing what it had witnessed. It remembered the pause of stars, the conversations, the slow training of wonder until it learned manners. It remembered Rick's restless laughter, metallic at first, then warm at the edges, and Morty's steady curiosity that kept reflecting him back like a mirror that forgave distortion. The sky, which had watched countless finales, understood that this one wasn't collapse but calibration. The universe had finally found the correct breathing rate. Galaxies inhaled over centuries and exhaled over kindness. Suns cooled slightly content. Even gravity loosened its tie. Down below, silence distributed comfort evenly. The bakery cooled, the river clicked gently against stones, and wind leaned against doors like a friend staying to check if everyone got home safely. Rick, always the lightest of sleepers, woke just enough to notice the hush. Through half-lidded eyes, he watched starlight hover across the ceiling. A brief panic stirred, old habit, but when nothing demanded explanation, it left as politely as it came. He turned to look at Morty, peaceful, one hand curved around that inert marble as if cradling compressed history. Rick smiled, that rare, small smile which required neither irony nor proof. Outside, light folded itself into constellations familiar, yet slightly edited. Every cluster that had once been named for battle, vengeance, or struggle now, bent gently into new formations. The embrace, the cup, the bridge, the equation, and above them all, faint but visible, the nap. No astronomer would record the change. The shift existed only for those who had learned to see warmth as data. The sky tested its rephrased design by humming the pattern Rick had drawn on the plateau. Where the gesture brushed against old starlight, the names of both travelers appeared, bright for a breath, then absorbed into the naming of everything else. Memory didn't need monuments when existence itself acted as archive. When dawn arrived, it stepped carefully through that altered heaven, scattering diluted gold in lieu of applause. The town woke slowly. Some inhabitants dreamed of impossible bridges. Others found forgotten kindnesses newly formulated in their minds. The baker whistled without knowing why her tune matched distant planetary rotation. Rick rose at last, joints protesting in familiar language. He made coffee out of pure defiance against tranquility. Morty blinked awake at the smell. "You're up early," the boy mumbled. "Universe came to show off," Rick said, gesturing toward the window. Outside, the new constellation still hovered before fading into daytime. Morty rubbed his eyes. "Looks different. Good different," Rick replied. "Like when someone finally forgives themselves in front of the mirror." They watched dough carts roll across the square, the simplest choreography imaginable. Between the bakery's windows, sunlight caught on the water of the fountain and broke into fragments, tiny prismatic echoes of the final equation, extending themselves quietly into commerce and breakfast. Morty turned to him.
"So what do we do with forever now?"
"We mispronounce it," Rick said, grinning into his cup. "Call it again." They left the mugs unwashed on purpose, so tomorrow would smell faintly of memory. Then they stepped into the street, shoes damp with dew. The world didn't ask much of them anymore. A passing child offered them a small drawing. 2 stick figures standing under a wobbly bridge made of stars. Rick thanked her, as though accepting a prize he pretended not to deserve. When they reached the edge of town, a breeze from the east tugged their coats outward. It carried a familiar phrase, not in words, but in the rhythm of wings overhead, the stretch between beats. "Thanks for noticing." They stopped walking, allowing gratitude its full volume. Morty looked sideways. "Did the universe just say thank you?" Rick shrugged. "Finally learned manners." They walked on until sound began to thin again, until distance became permission rather than separation. Hills opened wide like unrolled maps. Silence, having completed its apprenticeship, became their companion once more. And somewhere behind them, the bell on the table chimed just once to mark closure, the tiniest confirmation that everything still balanced between rest and readiness. By nightfall, they found another open ridge, softer than the first plateau, smelling of wet stone and rain deferred. They built no campfire. Stars took care of illumination. Morty fell asleep first, hand still around the marble that now glowed faintly again. Not bright, just heartbeat bright. Rick lay beside him, eyes fixed on constellations, quietly spelling their history anew. He traced each curve invisibly, mouthing the lessons: pause, kindness, promise, breath, and finally, peace. His lids sank under the literacy of it. Before consciousness folded, he whispered into the expanse, "Keep rewriting the story, big guy. We'll just lie here in the footnotes, happy to help with corrections." The stars, knowing language by now, twinkled a hush that meant yes. Dew gathered, night deepened, and across millions of sleeping worlds, the new constellations carried that soft consent, wherever eyes might someday dream upward. So ends it, not with silence breaking, but with silence humming itself awake.
And somewhere he's still out there,
Napping in the sun, a scientist unhurried, a boy still curious, their laughter folded neatly into the background noise of mercy. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.